Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The radio crackled at 6:47 a.m., pulling Christopher Brennan from his analysis of search grid coordinates. Static, then silence, then a voice he didn't recognize, strained, younger than the usual dispatch rotation. Ranger Brennan, this is Kalispell Command. We need you at the Grinnell Glacier trailhead. Immediately. Chris set down his coffee, the steam still rising in lazy spirals. Through the window of his cabin, Glacier National Park stretched endlessly white under February's grip. 23 years he'd worked these mountains, the last 7 as the park's senior SAR coordinator, and he'd learned to read the spaces between words. The dispatcher's tone carried something he couldn't categorize. Not quite panic. Something older. Copy that. What's the situation? A pause. Missing person. 16-year-old female. Emily Sawyer. She was part of a university field study group. Been gone 48 hours. The name detonated in his chest. Emily. David Sawyer's daughter. Chris and David had been roommates at Montana State, back when the world made sense, before Chris had learned that forests kept their own mathematics. He grabbed his jacket, already mentally cataloging the search protocols, the statistical probabilities of survival at this elevation in February. 2 days. The numbers weren't favorable. I'm 20 minutes out, he said. The Grinnell Glacier trailhead parking area hosted 3 vehicles when Chris arrived. A Park Service truck, a Montana State University van with rust bleeding through white paint, and a silver Subaru that looked rental clean. A cluster of people stood near the trailhead sign, their breath forming small clouds in air that tasted like iron and coming snow. Chris recognized Tom Whitehorse, the Blackfeet liaison officer, standing slightly apart from the others, his eyes on the tree line. A woman in her late 20s approached as Chris killed his engine. Professor, he guessed, noting the university fleece and the way she held a clipboard like a shield. Ranger Brennan, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. I was leading the winter ecology study. Her voice carried the brittle precision of someone forcing themselves not to break. Emily was in my group. She's one of my best students. God, I should have. Walk me through what happened, Chris said, keeping his tone level. Blame was a luxury that came after finding people alive. Dr. Chen's hands shook as she consulted her clipboard. We split into 3 groups on Monday morning. Emily's team was documenting snow depth and temperature variations along the lower valley trail. They were supposed to return by 15 hours. When they didn't show by 16:30, I went looking. Found the other 2 students at marker 7. Hypothermic, but okay. Emily wasn't with them. They got separated? They said she wanted to check a temperature anomaly about 200 meters north of the trail. The readings were strange. Sudden warm spot in the snowpack, they said. Didn't make sense for the conditions. Dr. Chen's voice dropped. She told them she'd be 15 minutes. That was the last time anyone saw her. Chris pulled out his topographic map. The paper softened from years of folding and unfolding. Marker 7 put Emily's last known position roughly 3 miles into the trail, elevation 5,400 feet. Standard protocol: establish a point last seen, create expanding search grids, calculate drift patterns based on terrain and weather. But something in Dr. Chen's account snagged in his mind like a thorn. Temperature anomaly, he said. In February, in a snowpack that should be uniformly frozen. I know how it sounds. But both students confirmed the readings, 15 degrees warmer than surrounding areas. They thought maybe geothermal activity, although there's no geothermal activity in this valley, Chris finished. He'd studied every geological survey of this region. The math didn't support it. Tom Whitehorse moved closer, his weathered face unreadable. Chris, you should see what we found. They hiked in silence, Chris's Garmin GPS marking their progress in cold decimal points. The trail threaded through lodgepole pine stands, their branches heavy with snow that seemed too white, almost luminous in the flat morning light. Tom set a pace that Chris recognized, not urgent, but not leisurely either. The pace of someone who knew these mountains had their own rhythms. At Marker 7, 2 Park Service rangers were establishing a temporary camp. Chris noted the efficiency of their movements, the way they didn't speak unless necessary. Professional fear, he thought, the kind that kept you alive in the backcountry. Over here, Tom said. The first thing Chris registered was the smell. Not decay. It was too cold for that, and too soon. Something else. Copper and musk and something that made his sinuses ache, like breathing air that had been locked in a freezer for years. The second thing was the tracks. They started human. Standard boot prints, size 7 or 8. The tread pattern matching the Vasca hiking boots Dr. Chen had described Emily wearing. But 30 meters into the trees, the prints changed. The stride lengthened impossibly, 8 feet between impressions, and the depth increased, as if something far heavier had suddenly occupied the same space. And the shape. Chris had tracked enough animals to know elk, bear, mountain lion. These matched nothing in his mental catalog. What the hell? Chris said, surprising himself by speaking aloud. Tom knelt beside one of the prints. His fingers hovered over the impression without touching it, tracing the outline in the air. Four-toed, elongated. See how the rear talon dug in deeper? Weight distribution is all wrong for any animal that should be in these mountains. Chris forced his analytical mind to engage. Track analysis was mathematics. Pressure, weight, gait, biomechanics. Could be a hoax, someone trying to confuse the search. In 48 hours, with a real missing girl? Tom's voice was flat. You believe that? Chris didn't answer. He was staring at the trees beyond the tracks. The pines grew in a pattern that troubled him. Not random like natural growth. Too uniform, too deliberate, like fingers spreading. And the snow between them lay undisturbed except for the tracks, as if nothing else, no mice, no birds, no insects, had dared cross this space. There's more, Tom said. They followed the tracks deeper. Chris's GPS showed them moving due north, off-trail, climbing toward the ridgeline. The terrain grew steeper, the snow deeper. Chris's breath burned in his lungs, each inhalation feeling somehow insufficient, as if the air itself had thinned beyond the elevation's explanation. Then they found the first cache. It hung 12 feet up in a Douglas fir, bound with what Chris initially thought was rope. Closer inspection revealed strips of cloth, bright yellow, the same color as Emily's jacket according to Dr. Chen's description. The fabric had been twisted and knotted around a bundle of something. Chris approached slowly, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. Tom, I need you to document this before we touch anything. While Tom photographed the cache from multiple angles, Chris studied the knots, methodical, deliberate, the work of something with intention, with purpose, not animal behavior. But the blood, and there was blood, frozen in dark rivulets along the bark, suggested violence that was decidedly not human. I'm bringing it down, Chris said. He used his extendable pole saw to cut the fabric strips. The bundle dropped with a thud that seemed too loud in the silent forest. Chris knelt beside it, pulling out his knife. Inside the makeshift bag, 3 textbooks, their spines cracked but intact. Field Guide to Winter Ecology, Introduction to Glaciology, and one that made Chris's hands still, Algonquian Legends and Oral Traditions. She was carrying that for her research? Chris asked, knowing the answer. Tom's face had gone the color of ash. Chris, we need to get everyone off this mountain. Now. We have protocols. We don't abandon searches because... Because what? Tom's voice rose, cracking the professional calm. Because we found tracks that shouldn't exist. Because the temperature readings made no sense. Because her books are cached 12 feet up like a predator storing meat. He pointed at the Algonquian text. You know what stores food in trees? You know what hunts in winter? What grows hungrier the more it eats? Chris did know, He'd grown up on the edge of Blackfeet territory, had heard the stories during late-night campfires when he was young enough to still believe in things beyond data and measurement. But those were stories, metaphors for starvation, for the winter madness that drove men to unthinkable acts, not real things that left tracks in snow. The Wendigo is a cultural teaching, Chris said, hearing how hollow his voice sounded. A cautionary tale about greed and consumption. Tell that to the 15 people who disappeared from this valley between 1912 and 1934, Tom said. Tell that to the Blackfeet elders who won't guide tourists on this trail during new moons. Tell that to... A sound cut through the forest. Not wind, not animal. Something that might have been a human voice if human voices could fracture into frequencies that made Chris's teeth ache. It came from upslope, from the direction the tracks led, and it carried in it something that defied his categorical mind. A resonance that felt like hunger translated into audio. Tom grabbed Chris's arm. We leave. Now. But Chris was already moving toward the sound. 23 years of training, of protocol, of statistical models for search and rescue couldn't be abandoned because of tracks and sounds. Emily Sawyer was up there, David's daughter, lost and afraid and depending on people like him to stay rational, to follow procedure to bring her home. I'm going to find her, Chris said. Then you're going alone, Tom replied. But he didn't turn back. Chris saw him reach into his jacket, pulling out something wrapped in red cloth. When Tom unwrapped it, Chris saw white sage and what looked like tobacco bound with sinew. My grandmother made me promise to carry this. Told me this valley was sick with old hunger. They climbed for another hour. The tracks continued their impossible stride, and Chris forced himself to document everything with detached precision. GPS coordinates, snow depth measurements, photographic evidence. His scientific mind built walls against the growing dread, categorizing and labeling each anomaly as if understanding would equal control. The temperature dropped as they ascended, which made no sense. At 7,200 feet, Chris's digital thermometer read -4 degrees Fahrenheit. 50 meters higher it read -19. Another 100 meters -32. His breath froze instantly, ice crystals forming in his beard. Beside him, Tom had gone silent, his eyes scanning the tree line with ancestral wariness. They found Emily's backpack at 7,600 feet. It sat upright in the snow, perfectly positioned as if placed rather than dropped. Chris approached it like it might detonate. Nothing disturbed, no signs of struggle. The pack's contents were still inside. Water bottles frozen solid, granola bars, first aid kit, extra gloves, and her phone. Chris powered it on, watching the battery indicator show 73%. Service showed 0 bars, expected this far from any tower. But the last activity made his hands clench. A voice memo recorded at 14:47 on Monday, roughly 30 minutes after Emily had separated from her group. He pressed play, static first, then Emily's voice, young and terrified. Don't know if this will send, but I need to tell someone what I'm seeing. The temperature anomaly wasn't geothermal. There's something wrong with the snow here. It's warm but not melting. And the trees. Oh God, the trees. They're arranged in patterns like symbols, like the ones in the Algonquian text, the protective circles, but reversed, inverted. And I can hear... The recording fractured into static, then Emily's voice again, but different, slower, flat. It's so hungry, I can feel it. It's been hungry for so long, it wants to show me. It wants me to understand what it means to never be full, never be satisfied, never be... The recording ended. Chris played it twice more, his analytical mind trying to find rational explanations. Hypothermia could cause confusion, panic could distort perception, but Emily's descriptions, the patterns in the trees, the inverted symbols, required knowledge she shouldn't have possessed, knowledge that suggested she'd understood what she was facing. She knew, Tom said quietly. She studied the legends. She recognized the signs. Then why did she keep going? Chris demanded. Why not run back to her group? Because that's what it does. It calls. It makes you curious. It makes you want to understand. Tom's voice carried the weight of generations. And once you answer that call, once you try to comprehend it, you're already being consumed. They pressed on, following the tracks that were no longer tracks but deep gouges in the frozen earth, as if whatever made them had grown heavier, denser, more substantial. The forest opened into a clearing at 7,800 feet, a space that shouldn't exist, too circular to be natural, ringed by trees whose bark had been stripped away in spiral patterns. In the center stood a structure, branches woven together with disturbing skill, forming a framework that suggested shelter but felt like cage. And hanging from the framework, clothes. Emily's yellow jacket, her fleece layer, her thermal shirt, arranged in descending order, forming a path that led into the structure's dark interior. "She's in there," Chris said. "Something's in there," Tom corrected. Whether it's still Emily is another question. Chris pulled out his flashlight, the LED beam seeming pathetically small against the clearing's darkness. His radio crackled, the first sound it had made since they'd left Marker 7. A voice emerged through static, distorted beyond recognition. "Hungry. So hungry. Never enough." He switched it off. The structure's entrance was low, forcing him to crouch. Tom remained outside, the sage bundle in his hands now lit, smoke rising in a thin line. Chris's light penetrated the interior in stuttering flashes. More clothes, scattered bones, animal, he told himself, just animal. And at the back, curled in a fetal position, Emily. She was alive. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, but her skin had taken on a waxy translucence, and even in the flashlight's stark illumination, Chris could see frost forming in her hair, on her eyelashes, across her exposed skin. "Emily," he said, crawling toward her. "Emily, it's Ranger Brennan. I'm getting you out of here." Her eyes opened, brown, like her father's. But the pupils were too dilated, swallowing the iris, and when she looked at Chris, he saw no recognition, no fear, only hunger. "It showed me," she whispered. "Showed me what it's like. To eat and never be full. To consume and only grow emptier. It's been here so long, waiting, feeding on scraps, on hikers who wander off trail, on animals that cross its territory. But it's never enough. It will never be enough." Chris reached for her arm and she flinched away with speed that shouldn't be possible for someone in hypothermia. "You're in shock. We need to get you warm, get you down the mountain." "It's inside me now," Emily said. Her voice carried harmonics, layers that hurt to hear. "I let it in. I wanted to understand, and understanding is the first taste. Knowledge is how it feeds. Every time you try to comprehend it, every time you apply your logic and your measurements, you're giving it more. You're making it real." Behind Chris, Tom was chanting something in Blackfeet, his voice rising and falling in patterns that felt older than the mountains. The sage smoke drifted into the structure, and where it touched Emily, she hissed, an inhuman sound that resonated in Chris's bones. "We have protocols for extraction," Chris said, his mind clinging to procedure like a lifeline. "Standard hypothermia treatment, medical evac. You're going to be fine." Emily smiled, and her teeth seemed too white, too sharp. "You still don't understand. Your protocols, your measurements, your rational mind. That's what it wants. That's what feeds it. Every search, every investigation, every attempt to explain what happened here. You're completing the cycle. You're making sure it can hunt again." She lunged. Chris's tactical training saved him. 23 years of self-defense protocols activating before his conscious mind registered the threat. He rolled backward, Emily's grasping hands missing his throat by inches. She moved with impossible fluidity, her limbs bending at angles that violated biomechanics, her face contorting into something that wore Emily's features, but answered to hunger. Tom was there, pulling Chris from the structure, throwing the lit sage bundle inside. The smoke billowed, thick and acrid, and Emily's shriek split the air, not pain, but rage at being denied sustenance. They ran, the forest blurred around them, Chris's GPS forgotten, all protocol abandoned for pure survival instinct. Behind them, sounds pursued, heavy footfalls that matched no animal, and underneath, a voice that fractured into many voices, all speaking in unison. Hungry, always hungry, never enough. Understand, understand, understand. Tom grabbed Chris's arm, yanking him north when Chris's panic wanted to go east. Not that way. The patterns in the trees, they're designed to loop you back. Old magic. Older than my people. We have to break the design. They crashed through snow and deadfall, Chris's lungs screaming, his rational mind finally catastrophically breaking under the weight of what he'd seen. Emily's face, her teeth, the way she moved, the hunger in her eyes that was hunger for something beyond food, hunger for meaning, for understanding, for completion. And he had fed it. With every measurement, every analysis, every attempt to apply logic to what defied logic, the pursuing sounds grew distant, then silent. Chris and Tom collapsed against a boulder at the tree line, both gasping, both knowing they'd crossed some threshold from which there was no return. She's gone, Tom said. Not dead. Worse. She's become part of it now. Another layer of hunger. Another way it feeds. Chris wanted to argue, wanted to cite statistics about exposure and hallucination, but his hands were shaking too hard to hold his GPS, and when he closed his eyes, he saw Emily's smile. That terrible, knowing smile. They stumbled back to the trailhead as the sun set, painting the snow in shades of red that looked like old blood. Dr. Chen rushed forward, hope dying in her eyes as she saw their faces. "Did you find her?" she asked. Chris opened his mouth, but no words came. How could he explain what they'd found? That Emily was both lost and found, absent and present, human and other. That she'd become something that existed in the space between categories, beyond his ability to measure or quantify? "We need to close this section of the park," he finally said. "Immediately. No one goes north of Marker 7. No one. But Emily is gone," Tom said, his voice carrying the finality of burial. The official report Chris filed 3 days later cited hypothermia and probable fatal exposure. The search was called off after a week, when no trace of Emily Sawyer could be found. Tom Whitehorse resigned from the Park Service and returned to the Blackfeet Reservation. Dr. Chen's winter ecology program was permanently canceled. Chris stayed. Someone had to maintain the closure signs, to enforce the trail restrictions, to make sure no one else wandered into that valley. He told himself it was duty, protocol, professional responsibility. But late at night, when the wind howled through the pines, he knew the truth. He stayed because Emily had been right. Understanding fed the hunger, and every day Chris spent analyzing what happened. Every night he replayed the sequence of events every time he tried to make sense of the impossible. He was feeding it, keeping it real, ensuring it could hunt again. The Wendigo didn't need to kill. It needed witnesses. It needed people like Chris with their measurements and their protocols and their desperate need to explain. Because every explanation gave it form. Every attempt to understand gave it substance. Every rational mind that broke trying to comprehend it became another offering to its endless hunger. Chris understood that now, and understanding was the first taste. He sits in his cabin most nights, staring at the tree line, watching for movement that follows no pattern he can name. His Garmin GPS rests on the desk, its coordinates meaningless, its data corrupted by something that exists between the numbers. The radio occasionally crackles with voices he doesn't recognize, speaking in frequencies that shouldn't broadcast. And sometimes when the moon is new and the temperature drops without meteorological explanation, he sees her, Emily, standing at the edge of the forest, her yellow jacket bright against the snow, her eyes reflecting light that comes from no source. She waves. She smiles. She invites him to understand more. Chris never approaches, but he never looks away either. Because looking away would mean admitting defeat, abandoning protocol, accepting that some things defy analysis, and his rational mind, broken, fractured but still desperately grasping for order, cannot allow that. So he watches, and measures, and tries to understand. And with every attempt, every observation, every desperate grasp at explanation, he feeds the hunger that waits in Glacier's northern valleys, the hunger that wears Emily's face, the hunger that has learned to speak in data and coordinates and all the precise language of the rational world. The hunger that knows the best way to consume a man like Christopher Brennan is to let him consume himself, one logical explanation at a time, until there's nothing left but appetite, dressed in the costume of reason. The last entry in his search log, dated March 15, 2014, reads, "Temperature anomaly detected at marker 7. Readings indicate 15-degree variation from expected baseline. Recommend investigation." He never filed the report, but every night he reads it again, his finger hovering over the send button, knowing that pressing it would be the final offering, the completion of the cycle. The moment when his need to understand would transform into understanding itself, and understanding, as Emily had shown him, was just another word for being devoured. In the silence of his cabin, surrounded by topographic maps and GPS coordinates and all the tools of measurement that once gave his life meaning, Christopher Brennan sits and waits. Outside, the forest breathes. Inside, the hunger grows. And between the two, in the space where rationality meets the ancient and the unexplainable, something that was once a 16-year-old girl named Emily Sawyer stands patient and smiling, knowing that sooner or later, the need to know will outweigh the wisdom of ignorance. Because that's what the Wendigo taught her. That hunger isn't about consumption. It's about the space between appetite and satisfaction, the eternal reaching that never grasps, the question that devours the questioner. Chris closes his eyes and sees her standing there, backlit by impossible light, her mouth open in invitation or warning, or perhaps both. And he knows, with the last flickering remnants of his rational mind, that the only way to survive the Wendigo is to stop trying to understand it. But understanding is what makes him human. And giving up understanding would be a death of its own kind. So he chooses the hunger. He chooses the eternal question. He chooses to keep measuring, keep analyzing, keep trying to solve the equation that has no solution. And in the forest, something ancient and patient and eternally unsatisfied smiles its too-white smile and settles in to feed. The wind carries voices through Glacier National Park's northern valleys, speaking in languages both Algonquian and English, and something older than both. They speak of temperature anomalies and inverted symbols and the terrible revelation that sometimes the only thing worse than dying in the wilderness is surviving it with understanding intact. Christopher Brennan hears those voices every night, and every night he tells himself tomorrow will be the day he stops listening. Tomorrow he will abandon his protocols and accept mystery. Tomorrow he will choose ignorance over knowledge. Tomorrow he will finally, mercifully stop feeding the hunger. But tonight, he opens his laptop and begins to type a new analysis of the search for Emily Sawyer. Because perhaps if he examines the data one more time, applies one more framework, constructs one more rational explanation, he will finally understand what happened in those frozen woods. And in understanding, perhaps he will find peace. The Wendigo knows better. It has fed on searchers and scientists and analysts for longer than the mountains have had names. It knows that peace and understanding are mutually exclusive, that the rational mind is the sweetest meal, for it seasons itself with its own logic, marinates itself in its own need to know. In the clearing at 7,800 feet, Emily Sawyer, or the thing that wears her shape, tends the structure of branches. She weaves new patterns into the design, patterns that will call the next curious mind, the next person who needs to understand, the next fool who believes that knowledge is power rather than just another form of hunger. And she waits, patient, eternal, empty, so hungry, always hungry, never full, understanding. Nathan Cross had been a ranger at Olympic National Park for 11 years, but he'd only been sleeping through the night for the past 3 weeks. Before that, 3 years of waking at 2:47 a.m. exactly, the same time the Henderson kid's mother had called dispatch. 3 years of lying in the dark of his cabin off Sol Duke Road, listening to his pulse hammer against the silence, waiting for the phone to ring again with news of another failure. His therapist in Port Angeles, Dr. Brennan, who smelled like peppermint tea and maintained careful eye contact, said the precision of the time was his mind's way of controlling the uncontrollable. Nathan thought that was probably bullshit, but he kept the appointments anyway because the alternative was losing his job. The morning Emily Rodriguez disappeared started unremarkably. October 19, 2014, Saturday. Nathan's Motorola CP200 crackled at 6:23 a.m. while he was making coffee in the ranger station at the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center, the dark liquid catching weak light through windows still beaded with last night's rain. The Douglas firs outside stood massive and indifferent in the pre-dawn gray, their trunks wrapped in moss that glowed faintly green even in the dimness. "Cross, you copy?" Sarah Yamamoto's voice carried the particular flatness that meant paperwork, not emergency. "Go ahead. Got a vehicle in the lot. White Toyota 4Runner, Washington plates. No permit displayed. Been there since Thursday, according to the log. Can you run it?" Nathan copied down the plate number, already knowing this would eat his morning. Solo vehicles staying overnight always meant something, usually something tedious, occasionally something that made the pulse jump. He'd learned to distinguish between the two in his first year. The Henderson case had been the exception, the one that should have been tedious but wasn't, and that's what ruined everything. He found the 4Runner in question at the north end of the Hoh River Trail parking area, tucked between two empty spaces as if its owner had been considerate about not taking up too much room. The windows held that particular clarity of recent cleaning, a North Face sticker on the rear window, an REI member tag hanging from the mirror. The permit envelope lay on the dashboard, properly filled out. Emily Rodriguez, solo hiker, 3-day backcountry trip, Elk Lake destination. Age 28, emergency contact, Maria Rodriguez, with a Seattle number. Nathan felt something shift in his chest, a small dropping sensation like missing a step in the dark. Solo hiker, 3 days, no return. He pulled his notebook from his breast pocket and wrote down everything visible through the windows. Empty water bottle and cup holder, a paperback book on the passenger seat, something by Oliver Sacks, a green day pack in back, a fleece jacket folded neatly on top of it. No signs of disturbance, no signs of hasty departure. The vehicle simply sat there waiting for someone who hadn't come back. He radioed it in from his truck, watching the 4Runner through his windshield while Sarah ran the registration. The moss on the surrounding trees seemed thicker here at the trailhead, great hanging curtains of it that moved in wind too slight to feel. The Hoh was the wettest place in the continental United States, a temperate rainforest where some trees had been growing since before Columbus, and the weight of all that time and moisture pressed down on everything. Nathan had always loved this quality about the forest, the way it made human concerns seem temporary and small. After Henderson, he'd started to hate it. Registration comes back to Emily Rodriguez, Seattle address. Sarah's voice came through. Matches the permit. Want me to start a missing persons protocol? Not yet. Let me hike up to Elk Lake first. Could be she extended her trip and just didn't update her permit. Or met someone on the trail, you know how it goes. But Nathan knew it didn't go like that, not really. Experienced hikers didn't leave vehicles without updating permits. They didn't disappear from one of the most well-trafficked trails in the park. The Hoh River Trail was 17 miles of gentle grade along the riverbank, popular enough that solo hikers rarely went more than a few hours without seeing someone else. Elk Lake sat at the 13-mile mark, a clear alpine tarn surrounded by old growth, with an established campsite and a small wooden shelter maintained by the Park Service. He was stalling, and he knew it. He was standing in a parking lot finding reasons to delay the moment when he'd have to shoulder his pack and walk into the forest looking for someone who might already be gone. Dr. Brennan would call this avoidance behavior. Nathan called it being careful. By 7:45 a.m. he was on the trail, his 60-liter pack loaded with rope, first aid, emergency bivvy, water purification, 3 days of food he wouldn't need, and the small orange dry bag he never mentioned to anyone. Inside the dry bag was a book his grandmother had given him before she died, a leather-bound copy of The Lesser Key of Solomon, pages brittle with age, annotations in her spidery handwriting filling the margins. His grandmother had been born in Cork, Ireland, and brought with her the kind of Catholicism that predated councils and reforms, the kind that knew saints and demons occupied the same spectrum, and sometimes you needed protection from both. Nathan had been raised to think this was quaint old-world superstition. After Henderson, he'd started carrying the book. The forest swallowed him within minutes of leaving the parking area. The trail followed the Hoh River through ancient groves where Sitka spruce and western hemlock rose like cathedral pillars, their roots wrapped in electric green moss, their branches lost in the canopy 70 meters overhead. Everything dripped. The sound of water was constant, the river's rush, rain falling from leaves, streams trickling over stones, creating an acoustic blanket that muffled all other noise. Nathan's boots squelched in mud. His breath came easy. This was the part of the job he'd once loved, the solitude and grandeur, the way the forest reduced you to appropriate scale. Now it just felt like being watched. He made good time, stopping only twice to check his Garmin E-Trex GPS unit and note landmarks. At mile 7, he passed another hiker coming down, a college-aged kid with expensive gear and the slightly dazed expression of someone who'd spent several days away from screens and noise. "Morning," Nathan said, keeping his tone casual. "You see anyone camping up at Elk Lake?" The kid paused, adjusting his pack straps. "I was up there 2 nights ago, Thursday night. There was a woman at the campsite when I got there around 4. She was setting up a tent, didn't talk much. I camped at the shelter, left early Friday morning before she was up." "Remember what she looked like?" "Hispanic, maybe? Dark hair and a ponytail. 30s? I didn't really look that close, you know. She seemed like she wanted to be left alone." Nathan felt that dropping sensation again. "She seem okay? Not injured or distressed?" "Seemed fine. Why?" "Her vehicle's still at the trailhead, just checking on her." The kid's expression shifted into concern, that look people got when abstract wilderness danger suddenly became concrete and personal. "Oh damn, I mean, she really did seem fine. Normal. Just quiet." Nathan thanked him and continued up the trail. The forest grew denser as he gained elevation, the moss thicker, the light greener and more filtered. By mile 10, his shirt was soaked through with sweat despite the October chill, and his knee, the one that had never quite healed right after he'd torn it scrambling down a ravine looking for Henderson, was starting to announce its presence with small electric pains. He stopped to refill his water bottle from a crystal-clear tributary stream, dropping in a purification tablet and watching it dissolve, thinking about timing. Emily Rodriguez had been seen Thursday night at Elk Lake. The college kid had left early Friday morning. Today was Saturday. That meant she'd been alone up there for at least 36 hours, probably more. Long enough for something to have happened. Long enough for a fall, a medical emergency, an animal encounter. Any of the 1,000 ways the wilderness could kill you if you made one wrong move. Long enough for something else. He reached Elk Lake at 11:34 a.m., emerging from the forest into the small clearing that surrounded the water. The lake sat like a dark mirror among the trees, maybe 200 meters across, fed by snowmelt from the higher peaks to the south. The campsite occupied the eastern shore, a small wooden shelter with a shake roof, several tent platforms, a food hang system with cables and pulleys. Empty. Nathan stood at the edge of the clearing, scanning for signs of occupancy. No tent, no gear visible around the shelter. The fire ring held only cold ashes. His pulse had started to accelerate, a feeling in his throat like swallowing something too large. He forced himself to breathe slowly through his nose, counting to 4 on the inhale, 4 on the exhale, the way Dr. Brennan had taught him. Then he saw the pack. It sat on one of the tent platforms, a red osprey pack with a silver hydration bladder clipped to the side, positioned carefully in the center of the wooden surface as if someone had placed it there for display. Nathan approached slowly, his boots loud on the wooden platform. The pack was closed, the zippers all shut, the straps neatly tucked. It looked staged, arranged, wrong in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. He called out, "Emily Rodriguez, National Park Service. If you can hear me, please respond." His voice fell flat in the clearing, absorbed by the moss and water and massive trees. Nothing answered. The lake's surface remained perfectly still, reflecting the gray sky above. Nathan photographed the pack with his digital camera, department policy, then carefully opened it. The contents were what you'd expect. MSR tent still in its stuff sack, sleeping bag, camp stove, fuel canister, food bag with 3 days of dehydrated meals, first aid kit, headlamp, spare batteries, toiletries, a rolled-up sleeping pad. Everything organized, everything present. At the bottom of the pack, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, he found a journal. His hands hesitated over it. Personal effects, private thoughts. He should bag it as evidence, catalog it, maintain chain of custody. Instead, he opened it. The entries were dated, written in neat script with a blue felt tip pen. The most recent was from Thursday night. Made it to Elk Lake, 13.2 miles, my feet are screaming. The forest here is unbelievable. The trees are so old they make you feel like you're trespassing in a church. Set up camp around 4:30. There's another hiker in the shelter, young guy, keeping to himself. Perfect weather. Should be able to get some good wildlife photos tomorrow. Feeling peaceful for the first time in weeks. Thank you, Forrest. Nathan flipped back through earlier entries, scanning for anything unusual. Mostly routine hiking notes. Mileage, weather, trail conditions, observations about birds and plants. But 3 pages from the end, dated about 6 months ago, he found something different. Had that dream again, the singing. I can almost remember the melody when I wake up, but it slips away like water through fingers. Mom says I should talk to someone, but I don't know how to explain that I'm not scared of the singing. I want to find it. I want to know where it's coming from. Below that, written in different ink like it had been added later. The Quileute grandmother at the market today grabbed my arm and looked at me like she was seeing through to my bones. She said, "They're calling you." When I asked what she meant, she just shook her head and walked away. I should probably be more worried than I am. Nathan's skin felt too tight. He read the passage 3 more times, then carefully photographed the pages before closing the journal. The orange dry bag in his pack seemed suddenly heavy, pressing against his spine through the cushioned back panel. He searched the rest of the campsite methodically. The shelter was empty except for mouse droppings and a forgotten length of paracord. The food hang showed no signs of recent use. The fire ring was cold, no warmth remaining in the ashes. But at the edge of the clearing, where the forest began again on the western side of the lake, he found her boots. They sat on a moss-covered log, placed side by side with the laces tucked inside, as neat as if someone had just taken them off after a long day. Red Salomon trail runners, women's size 7, mud still drying on the tread. But no socks, no other clothes. Just the boots, arranged like an offering. Nathan's radio crackled. "Cross, you copy? It's been 4 hours. What's your status?" He thumbed the transmit button. "At Elk Lake. Found the subject's pack and boots. No sign of the subject. She's in the wind." A pause. "Copy that. You want search and rescue protocols?" "Affirmative. I'm going to do a preliminary search of the immediate area, but we're going to need dogs and a team. This doesn't feel right." "What doesn't feel right?" Nathan looked at the boots on the log, at the pack sitting centered on the platform, at the dark, still water of the lake. "Everything," he said. He spent the next 3 hours conducting a grid search around the campsite, moving in expanding circles, calling Emily's name until his voice went hoarse. The forest swallowed his shouts. The moss deadened his footsteps. He found nothing. No clothing, no signs of struggle, no disturbed vegetation, no blood. It was as if she'd simply removed her boots, placed them carefully on the log, and walked barefoot into the trees. But why? And where? The light was starting to fail when Nathan found the first symbol. It was carved into the bark of a massive Sitka spruce about 200 meters northwest of the campsite, past the point where the established trails ended, and the forest became true wilderness. Someone had used a knife or other sharp tool to cut away the outer bark, revealing the pale wood beneath, forming a design about 10 inches across. Nathan recognized it immediately from his grandmother's book. a circular pattern with a specific arrangement of marks that represented a warding sign, protection against spirits of the restless dead. He found the second symbol 30 meters further in, carved into another tree. Then a third. They formed a path leading deeper into the forest, away from anything human or safe. Nathan pulled out his digital camera and photographed each mark, his hands steady despite the way his pulse was hammering. These weren't casual carvings. Someone had cut them recently, within days, judging by the freshness of the exposed wood. Someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who was trying to keep something out. Or in. The fourth tree bore no carved symbol. Instead, someone had nailed pages to the bark with what looked like roofing nails. 4 sheets of paper arranged in a square pattern. The paper had been laminated, protected from the rain. Nathan pulled his headlamp from his pack and switched it on, the LED beam cutting white and harsh across the darkening forest. The pages were photocopies from an old text, the kind you'd find in a university special collections library or a private occult archive. The language was Latin and Old Irish with English translations written by hand in the margins. Nathan's Latin was rudimentary at best, but he could make out enough. These were passages from medieval grimoires about the Sluag. His grandmother had told him stories about the Sluag when he was young, usually when he'd been restless before bed, her voice low and rhythmic in the dark of his childhood room. The host of the unforgiven dead, she'd called them, spirits who had been denied entrance to heaven and hell both, condemned to fly in flocks through the night sky, hunting for souls of the dying to add to their restless company. They moved like birds, she'd said, but sounded like wind through empty rooms. They entered through windows left open to the west. They sang to those they'd chosen, a song so beautiful it made your teeth ache and your heart want to stop. The western coast of Ireland had been plagued by them for centuries, according to the stories. People would nail iron over their western windows. They'd paint protective symbols on their door frames. They'd bury their dead with stones in their mouths so the Sluag couldn't steal their breath. But those were just stories. Irish folklore. Superstition carried across an ocean by immigrants who'd needed something to explain the darkness and the dying. Except someone had carved protection symbols deep into a Washington forest. Someone had printed medieval grimoire passages about the Sluag and nailed them to trees as if they were real and present and dangerous. Nathan's headlamp beam swept across the text, catching on the handwritten notes. One passage had been heavily annotated. The Sluag call to those whose souls are already touched by death, those who have witnessed violent passing, those who carry the weight of the departed, those who have failed to protect. They sing the names of the lost ones, and their song is an invitation to join them, to stop running from what cannot be outrun. The handwriting wasn't Emily's. Nathan had seen her script in the journal. This was different, rushed, erratic, the letters pressing hard into the paper as if the writer had been shaking. He pulled out his camera and photographed the pages, then carefully removed them from the tree, folding them into a plastic evidence bag. His mind was working through possibilities, trying to find the rational explanation. Cult activity, mental illness, elaborate hoax, coincidence. But his hands were shaking as he packed the pages away, and the forest around him seemed to have grown darker and quieter, as if something was holding its breath. The radio crackled again. Cross Search and Rescue says they can't mobilize until first light. Conditions are deteriorating. They want you back at the trailhead. Nathan looked deeper into the forest where the protection symbols led. The darkness there was absolute, the kind of black that came from ancient trees blocking out all light, from fog settling into ravines where sun never reached. His flashlight beam barely penetrated 15 feet. "Copy," he said into the radio. "Heading back now." But he didn't move. He stood there with his headlamp illuminating the pages nailed to the tree, listening to the forest. The sound of water was constant, omnipresent. The faint rustle of wind in the high branches, his own breathing, and underneath it all, so faint he might have imagined it, something else. A sound like voices singing far away and getting closer, a melody that made his molars ache. Nathan switched off his headlamp and stood in complete darkness, listening. The singing continued, wordless but structured, a harmony that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. It was beautiful in the way that looking directly at the sun is beautiful, something that hurt even as it attracted. He'd heard that sound before. 3 years ago, in a different part of the park, while searching for the Henderson kid. He'd followed it for hours before his radio had finally crackled with news they'd found the body. At the time, he'd convinced himself it had been wind, or distant traffic, or auditory hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. Dr. Brennan had agreed. The mind plays tricks, she'd said, especially under pressure. But Emily Rodriguez had heard singing too. She'd written about it in her journal, dreams of melody that slipped away like water. Nathan reached into his pack and pulled out the orange dry bag. His fingers found the leather binding of his grandmother's book, the pages soft with age and handling. In the darkness, he couldn't read it, but he knew the passages by heart. His grandmother had made him memorize them, insisted on it, the way other grandmothers insisted grandchildren learn prayers. Protection, binding, dismissal. The old words that supposedly held power over the restless dead. Immundum spiritum, te adjuro, he whispered into the darkness. Per eum qui venturus es judicare vivos et mortuos. Unclean spirit, I adjure you. By him who shall come to judge the living and the dead. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It had weight and presence like something massive holding still. Nathan's heart was doing terrible things in his chest, a rhythm that felt borrowed and wrong. Then his radio crackled with static, and through it came a voice he recognized. Nathan. It was Henderson. The kid who'd been dead for 3 years, whose body they'd found wedged in a ravine, whose funeral Nathan had attended in Port Angeles with 200 other people who'd loved him. The kid's voice came through the radio with perfect clarity, no static, no distortion. Nathan, why didn't you find me sooner? Nathan's hand was on the radio, finger on the transmit button, but he couldn't make himself press it, couldn't make himself respond. His throat had closed completely. She's with us now. Henderson's voice continued through the radio. Emily, she heard us calling and she came. She understood what you didn't understand 3 years ago. That some of us are meant to join the host. Some of us are already halfway there before we die. Nathan's headlamp came back on, though he didn't remember switching it. The beam illuminated the forest ahead, and standing among the trees were figures. Human-shaped but wrong, their proportions subtly distorted, their faces pale and indistinct. They stood perfectly still, watching him. You carry us with you, the radio said in Henderson's voice. Every person you've failed, every call you've been too late to answer. We're all here, Nathan. We've been here the whole time. The Sluag don't steal souls. They gather the ones who are already lost. One of the figures moved closer. Emily Rodriguez, barefoot and pale, her hair unbound and hanging limp around her face. Her eyes were open but unfocused, looking past him at something he couldn't see. Her lips moved soundlessly. Nathan pulled the lesser key from his pack, his hands clumsy with fear. The book fell open to a page his grandmother had marked with a length of red thread, a passage in Latin and Old Irish about banishment and protection. He read aloud, his voice cracking, stumbling over the unfamiliar words. Imain man athar, agus en mik, agus en spiore nauim, ordaim dauib. Emily's eyes focused on him. Her mouth opened. What came out wasn't her voice, but many voices, overlapping and harmonizing, the song he'd been hearing. It was unbearably beautiful. It promised rest and release and an end to carrying everything. It promised that if he just walked forward, if he just joined them, he'd never again wake at 2:47 a.m. with his pulse hammering and his failures circling his bed like carrion birds. His feet were moving. He was walking toward her, toward them. The figures in the trees were multiplying, dozens now, all pale and watching and singing. His grandmother's book was still in his hands, but he couldn't remember why it mattered. The words on the page meant nothing compared to the song. Something in his pack was vibrating. His radio. Sarah's voice cutting through, calling his name, asking for his status, saying search and rescue was mobilizing early because conditions were worsening, and they needed to coordinate. Her voice was thin and distant compared to the song, but it was real. It was human. It was tethered to the world where he still had a job and a cabin and appointments with Dr. Brennan. Nathan stopped walking. He was 15 feet from Emily, close enough to see that her feet were torn and bleeding, that her skin had the waxy quality of meat left in water too long. He raised his grandmother's book and read again, louder this time, forcing the words through the song. Sluagna marb, ordaim dawib imiacht. By the authority of the living I command you depart. By iron and salt and sacred word I bind you to go. The figures didn't disappear, but they stopped advancing. Emily's mouth closed. The song faltered, becoming discordant. Nathan backed away slowly, keeping his eyes on them, continuing to recite the banishment. His Latin was terrible and his Irish worse, but his grandmother's voice was in his memory, guiding him through the pronunciation, her hand on his shoulder like she'd died knowing he'd need this. He backed up until he found the trail, then turned and ran. The forest tried to hold him. Branches caught his pack. Roots grabbed his boots. The trail seemed to shift and redirect under his feet. His headlamp beam bounced wildly, illuminating trees and moss and nothing that made sense. The Garmin GPS on his belt showed his position moving in circles, doubling back, going nowhere. He ignored it and ran by dead reckoning, following the slope downward, following the sound of the river. The singing followed him for miles, multiple voices in harmony, calling his name, calling Henderson's name, calling the names of everyone he'd failed to save in 11 years of ranger work. It made promises in tones that resonated in his bones. It offered belonging and purpose, and an end to the exhaustion of being alive and responsible. He burst out of the forest at the trailhead parking lot at 11:47 p.m., 8 hours after he'd found Emily's boots. His truck sat exactly where he'd left it. Emily's 4Runner was still there. The parking lot lights buzzed softly. Everything was painfully, impossibly normal. Nathan's radio crackled. Sarah's voice, no static, no distortion. Cross, what the hell? You missed 3 check-ins. Search and rescue is staging at the visitor center. We've been trying to reach you for hours. He leaned against his truck, breathing hard, his legs shaking. I'm at the trailhead, I'm coming in. Did you find her? Nathan looked back at the forest. The trees stood dark and massive under a clouded sky. No singing, no figures. Just the normal night sounds of the Hoh River Valley, water and wind, and the distant call of an owl. No, he said. I didn't find her. Search and rescue mobilized the next morning with dogs and a 12-person team. They found Emily Rodriguez's pack and boots exactly where Nathan had left them. They found the protection symbols carved into the trees and the grimoire pages Nathan had photographed. They searched for 3 days, expanding the radius, checking the lake, following every possible trail. The dogs found nothing. No scent trail, no body, no trace. On the 4th day, they called it. Emily Rodriguez had vanished into the Olympic wilderness, one of the small percentage of people who disappear each year from national parks without explanation. The official report listed her as a probable fall victim or animal encounter, body not recovered due to terrain and wildlife. Her vehicle was impounded. Her family came from Seattle and held a memorial service. The case remained technically open, but inactive. Nathan Cross did not participate in the search. He'd gone on medical leave the morning after his initial hike, citing his knee injury and psychological distress. Dr. Brennan signed the forms without question. He'd shown up at her office at 6 a.m. without an appointment, and whatever she'd seen in his face had made her pull him inside and lock the door. He told her everything. The singing, the figures, the radio speaking in Henderson's voice. Emily standing in the forest with bleeding feet and empty eyes. Dr. Brennan listened without interrupting, her hands folded carefully in her lap, her expression neutral. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Nathan, I'm going to be very direct with you. You experienced what appears to be a severe psychotic break brought on by trauma, exhaustion, and the stress of re-experiencing a previous traumatic event. This is treatable, but you need to be honest with me about what you took into that forest." I didn't take anything, no drugs, no alcohol, I was completely sober. Then we need to consider that you may be experiencing a neurological event. I want you to see a doctor. Today. I'm going to drive you to the hospital." Nathan looked at his hands. They weren't shaking anymore. That was something. "You don't believe me. I believe you experienced something traumatic. Whether it was objectively real or a manifestation of psychological distress is less important than making sure you're safe." He didn't go to the hospital. He went home to his cabin off Salduke Road, and he took his grandmother's Lesser Key of Solomon from the orange dry bag, and he read it cover to cover. The annotations in her spidery handwriting described things his rational mind couldn't accept. Protection rituals, binding ceremonies, lists of the restless dead and the signs they were near, methods for warding a dwelling, methods for cleansing a person who'd been touched by the sluagh. At the back of the book, in a section written entirely in his grandmother's hand, he found this: "The sluagh gather those who are already departing, those who carry death inside them, guilt, grief, failure that has no forgiveness. They don't steal. They simply show you what you've been running from, and they offer you the choice to stop running." The song is an invitation. Once you hear it clearly, you must answer one way or another. Either you bind yourself back to the living world through ritual and commitment, or you join the host. There is no middle ground. The in-between is where they hunt. Below that, dated 3 months before she died. "Nathan will hear them. I've seen it in his dreams, the way he carries weight even as a child. When it happens, he needs to know. The choice is his. Always his. No one can make it for him. But if he chooses to stay, he must do the work. He must bind himself, he must say the words. Otherwise, they'll come for him again and again until he's too tired to refuse." Nathan read the passage 7 times. Then he started gathering materials. Over the next 4 weeks, while officially on medical leave, he did the work his grandmother's book described. He lined every western-facing window of his cabin with cold iron, railroad spikes from a demolition yard, bent nails, lengths of rebar. He painted protection symbols above every doorframe using paint mixed with salt and ash from burned oak. He buried stones at the 4 corners of his property, with words carved into them in Latin and Irish. He learned the banishment prayers by heart, reciting them every morning and evening until the words felt natural in his mouth. And every night, just before sleep, he made a choice. Out loud. Speaking into the darkness of his bedroom. "I choose to stay. I choose the living world. I choose to carry what I carry and keep walking anyway." The singing didn't stop. He still heard it sometimes, distant and beautiful and promising. But it got no closer. The figures didn't appear at the edges of his vision. Henderson's voice didn't come through his radio. The sluagh had made their offer. Nathan had refused. On November 23, 2014, a hiker found Emily Rodriguez's body in a ravine 6 miles north of Elk Lake, far off any established trail. She'd fallen approximately 40 feet, multiple fractures, death likely instantaneous according to the coroner. The body showed signs of animal scavenging. Time of death was estimated as late October, consistent with the timeline of her disappearance. The official finding was accidental death. The symbols and grimoire pages were noted in the report as evidence of Emily's interest in occult practices, possibly related to mental health issues. The fact that she'd removed her boots before walking into the forest was attributed to hypothermia-induced paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where dying people inexplicably remove their clothing in the final stages of freezing to death. Nathan read the report in the visitor center break room, drinking coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner. Sarah Yamamoto sat across from him, watching his face carefully. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," Nathan said. "I'm okay. You're coming back next week?" "That's the plan." Sarah nodded. "Good. We need you. This place doesn't run right without you." Nathan folded the report and put it in his pocket. Through the break room window, he could see the forest, the massive trees, the hanging moss, the eternal green twilight. It was beautiful. It was dangerous. It was where he'd chosen to work, to live, to spend his days among the kind of wilderness that reminded humans they were small and temporary and not in control. He could hear singing, very faint, at the edge of perception. But it was outside. It wasn't in his head. And as long as he kept doing the work, the iron and salt and sacred words, the daily choice spoken into darkness, it would stay outside. "Yeah," he said again. "I'm okay." He wasn't, not really. He'd never be okay the way he'd been before Henderson, before Emily, before he'd learned that some stories his grandmother told weren't stories at all, but warnings carefully disguised as folklore. But okay was relative. Okay was waking up without your pulse hammering. Okay was going through your day without waiting for the phone to ring with news of another failure. Okay was understanding that the forest held things older and stranger than ranger training prepared you for, and choosing to walk into it anyway because someone had to watch, someone had to warn, someone had to stand between the living and the host of the unforgiven dead. Nathan Cross went back to work the following Monday. He carried his grandmother's book in the orange dry bag. He kept iron in his pockets. He said the words every morning and evening. And when hikers went missing in the Olympic wilderness, and they did every season, small percentages that added up, he searched for them knowing that sometimes what you found was worse than what you'd lost. But he searched anyway, because the choice was his, always his, and he'd already made it, binding himself back to the living world one day at a time, one prayer at a time, one morning of waking up and choosing to stay. The sluags sang in the forest. They always had. They always would. But Nathan Cross had learned to sing back. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Thomas Brennan had learned to ignore the whispers in his own head, but the radio static crackling through his Motorola at 4:47 a.m. on October 12, 2008, carried a different quality of wrongness. The dispatcher's voice emerged fragmented through layers of interference, each word requiring effort to extract from the noise, and Thomas found himself gripping the handset tighter than necessary as he sat up in the narrow bed of the ranger station. Missing person, solo female hiker, Rachel Anderson, 27, last radio contact 36 hours ago, Sawbill Trail area, reporting unusual activity from another camper. Thomas pressed the transmit button, his thumb finding the familiar ridged surface. Brennan acknowledging. What kind of unusual activity? More static. Then, subject reported hearing screaming in the forest. Her words were, a pause, the kind that suggested someone reading from notes they found disturbing. Screaming that sounded wrong, like it was trying to sound human. Last known position approximately 2 miles northeast of Sawbill Lake, near the Alton Lake Portage. Thomas was already pulling on his uniform pants, the green fabric still holding yesterday's cold. Outside the station windows, the boreal forest of Superior National Forest pressed close in the pre-dawn darkness. Millions of pine and spruce creating a wall of black that seemed to absorb, rather than reflect, the weak light from his lamp. He had worked this section of the boundary waters for 11 years, knew the interconnected lakes and portage trails the way some men knew city streets, understood the particular way sound carried across water and through dense stands of trees. He also knew, though he rarely let himself think about it directly, that the forest could produce sounds that defied easy explanation. 3 years ago, during a search for a missing kayaker on Knife Lake, Thomas had spent 72 hours in the backcountry, and something had happened in those woods that his incident reports never quite captured. The kayaker's body had been found eventually, death by exposure, nothing unusual in the official documentation. But Thomas remembered the footprints he'd found circling his tent that second night, prints that started human-sized and seemed to elongate with each circuit, as if whatever made them was stretching as it walked. He remembered waking to his own voice calling his name from the tree line. He remembered the kayaker's face when they'd found him, not peaceful but frozen in an expression of such profound hunger that Thomas had dreamed about it for months afterward. The department psychologist had used words like trauma response and stress-induced hallucination. Thomas had nodded, accepted the mandatory leave, and returned to work with those memories sealed behind a thick wall of deliberate normalcy. But sometimes, usually at moments like this, the wall developed cracks. He loaded his pack with practiced efficiency. Garmin GPS unit, first aid kit, water filtration system, emergency beacon, flares, compass, topographic maps of the Sawbill area already laminated and marked with grid coordinates. His hands moved through the familiar ritual while his mind ran through the variables. October in the Boundary Waters meant temperatures dropping into the 30s at night, sometimes lower. If Rachel Anderson had been out there for 36 hours without proper gear or shelter, hypothermia became the primary concern. If she was injured, the timeline compressed further. The if she was still alive hung unspoken in the morning air as Thomas locked the station and headed for his truck. The drive to the Sawbill Trail parking area took 45 minutes along Highway 2, then the Sawbill Trail Road cutting north through increasingly dense forest. Dawn arrived slowly, reluctantly, the sun seeming to struggle against the thick overcast that had settled over northern Minnesota like a gray woolen blanket. Thomas passed two other vehicles, both logging trucks heading south, their presence somehow reassuring in their mundane functionality. The parking area held only one vehicle besides his own, a silver Honda CR-V with Colorado plates, the rear window decorated with the predictable array of hiking and national park stickers. Rachel Anderson's vehicle, he assumed, and a quick glance through the windows confirmed it. A woman's jacket draped across the back seat, a Nalgene bottle in the cup holder, a dog-eared copy of a field guide to the Boundary Waters on the dashboard. Everything suggesting someone who planned to return. Thomas shouldered his pack and began walking. The Sawbill Trail itself was well maintained, wide enough for two people to walk side by side, marked with the familiar Superior National Forest signs every quarter mile. Thomas moved at a steady pace, his boots finding the rhythm automatically, his eyes constantly scanning the forest on either side. The trees here were predominantly red pine and white spruce, their trunks straight and closely spaced, the understory relatively clear thanks to the dense canopy blocking most sunlight. Mushrooms clustered around deadfall, their caps beaded with moisture. A raven called somewhere to the east, its voice harsh against the morning quiet. At the 2-mile mark, Thomas turned northeast onto a smaller trail, little more than a footpath, that would eventually connect to the Alton Lake portage. The GPS unit in his hand showed his position as a blue dot crawling across the topographic map, the elevation holding steady, around 1,850 feet. Rachel's last known coordinates put her somewhere in the maze of small lakes and marshy lowlands between Sawbill and Alton, an area Thomas knew could be treacherous for solo hikers, easy to become disoriented, easier still to injure yourself on the rocky portages. He found the first sign a half-mile down the footpath. Someone had arranged stones in a pattern across the trail, not a random scatter but a deliberate construction, 12 smooth river stones placed to form a circle, and inside the circle 3 smaller stones stacked in a cairn. Thomas crouched beside it, studying the arrangement without touching it. The stones were wet, but not from recent rain. When he leaned closer, he caught a smell that made something in his stomach twist, a sweetness like overripe fruit mixed with something sharper, more chemical. Trail markers left by hikers weren't unusual, but this felt different. The precision of it, the formality. Thomas took several photographs with his digital camera, then carefully displaced 2 of the outer stones, breaking the circle. It was superstition, maybe, or memory of his grandmother's stories about protective circles and the things they were meant to keep contained or keep out. He rose and continued walking, but now the morning felt heavier somehow, the forest pressing closer. The second sign came 20 minutes later, a birch tree with bark stripped from its trunk in long vertical tiers, the white wood beneath scored with what looked like claw marks. Thomas examined them closely, trying to match them to bear or wolf, but the spacing was wrong, the depth inconsistent. At the base of the tree he found a scattered pile of bones, small ones, rabbit or squirrel, picked completely clean and arranged in a radiating pattern like the spokes of a wheel. Thomas marked the location on his GPS and moved on, but his hand drifted to the canister of bear spray on his belt, fingers checking its position. The trail descended toward a low, marshy area, the ground becoming spongy beneath his boots, water seeping into his footprints. Here the spruce gave way to tamarack, their needles already turning gold in preparation for winter, and the air smelled of decomposition and standing water. Thomas could hear the soft lap of lake water somewhere ahead, through the trees, and he oriented toward it, knowing that most campers in this area set up along shorelines where the ground was firmer and the water access easier. He almost missed the canoe. It was pulled partway onto the shore of a small unnamed lake, maybe 200 yards across, its surface like hammered pewter under the overcast sky. The canoe was a rental from the outfitter in Tofte, the company name still visible on its green hull, and it had been dragged above the waterline and overturned in the proper fashion to keep rain out. But the paddle lay several feet away, and when Thomas righted the canoe, he found the interior marked with long scratches, as if something with claws had scrabbled inside it. "Rachel Anderson," Thomas called, his voice carrying across the water and into the surrounding trees. "This is Park Ranger Thomas Brennan. If you can hear me, please respond." Nothing. Not even an echo, which seemed wrong given the acoustic properties of the lake. Just a flat silence that seemed to absorb his words. Thomas circled the canoe, studying the ground. He found boot prints. Women's, size 7 or 8. The tread pattern consistent with hiking boots, leading away from the shore and into the forest. But there were other impressions too, harder to read in the soft ground that made Thomas's jaw tighten. They looked almost like footprints but elongated, the toes spread too wide, the depth suggesting enormous weight despite the narrow profile. His grandmother had been Ojibwe, from the Red Lake Reservation, and she'd told him stories when he was young before his father had put a stop to what he called that superstitious nonsense. Stories about the Wendigo, the winter cannibal spirit that possessed men who tasted human flesh, that transformed them into creatures of insatiable hunger, their hearts turning to ice, their bodies stretching and thinning until they towered above the trees. His grandmother's voice came back to him across the decades. "The Wendigo is always hungry, Tommy. Always. It eats and grows bigger, but the hunger only gets worse. And it remembers being human. That's the terrible part. It remembers and it hates what it's become, but it can't stop eating." Thomas shook his head sharply, forcing the memory away. He was a park ranger in 2008, not a child listening to campfire stories. There were rational explanations for everything he'd seen so far. The stone circle could be some hiker's art project. The stripped tree could be a bear marking territory. The scratches in the canoe could be from raccoons. And the elongated prints could simply be normal footprints distorted by mud and water. But he pulled out his satellite phone anyway, his personal one, not the department-issued radio, and dialed the ranger station. Jeff Kowalski answered on the third ring. "It's Brennan," Thomas said. "I'm at an unnamed lake about 3 miles northeast of Sawbill, coordinates north 479342, west 90.8156. Found the missing hiker's canoe. No sign of her yet, but there's evidence suggesting she went into the forest heading northwest. I'm going to follow the trail, but I want someone to know my position." "Copy that. Want me to send backup?" Thomas almost said yes, but backup was Sarah Chen, and she had a 6-month-old at home, and some instinct told him that whatever was happening out here, he didn't want to spread it to more people. "Negative. Just log my position and keep the radio open. I'll check in every hour." "You got it. Be careful out there, Tom." Thomas ended the call and began following the boot prints into the forest, away from the lake, into the deeper wilderness where the trees grew so close together that full daylight became perpetual twilight. The prints were easy to track at first, clear impressions in the soft earth. Rachel's stride regular and purposeful, but as Thomas penetrated further into the woods, the prints began to show irregularities, hesitations, sudden direction changes, places where she'd clearly stopped and turned around, as if checking behind her. Then he found where she'd started running. The boot prints deepened, the stride lengthening, dirt kicked up at the toes. Thomas increased his own pace, following the trail through a dense stand of spruce, his pack bouncing against his shoulders. The forest had gone absolutely silent now. No birds, no wind in the trees, not even the usual rustle of squirrels in the canopy. just his own breathing, and the crunch of his boots on pine needles. He emerged into a clearing and stopped so abruptly he nearly fell. The clearing was maybe 30 feet across, ringed by spruce and pine, the ground covered with moss and fallen needles. In the center stood what remained of a tent, or what had been a tent before something had shredded it. The nylon fabric hung in strips from the bent poles, the sleeping bag inside torn open, the stuffing scattered across the clearing like synthetic snow. A backpack lay on its side, contents spilled out, clothes, food wrappers, a paperback book with its spine broken, and in the center of it all, drawn in the dirt with something that left dark stains, was a symbol that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. It was a circle with radiating lines, and inside it, what looked like a crude human figure, but stretched and distorted, the limbs too long, the mouth gaping. Around the outer edge of the circle, someone had scratched words in letters 2 inches high. Achin Windigo Nita Mama. Thomas knew just enough Ojibwe to recognize the words. Achin, monster. Windigo, the cannibal spirit. Nita Mama, he eats them first. His hands had started shaking. He pulled out his camera and photographed everything, documenting the scene with mechanical precision while his mind raced. Rachel had done this. Had to be Rachel. The handwriting was desperate, scratched deep into the earth, and near the edge of the clearing he could see where she'd used a stick, or her fingers to dig the letters. But why? What had she seen? What had driven her to leave this warning? And where was she now? Thomas circled the clearing slowly, looking for any indication of which direction she'd gone, and found it at the northwestern edge. More boot prints, and beside them, those other tracks, the elongated ones. They ran parallel for several yards, Rachel's and something else's, matching stride for stride, and then Rachel's tracks stopped. Not gradually, not with any sign of a scuffle or struggle. They simply ended, mid-stride, as if she'd been plucked off the ground. But the other tracks continued, deeper now, spaced further apart, suggesting a change in gait or speed or weight distribution. Thomas stood at the point where Rachel's tracks vanished and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 3 years. The absolute certainty that he was not dealing with anything that could be explained by training or protocol or rational thought. The forest around him felt wrong in a way that bypassed conscious analysis and went straight to some ancient part of his brain, the part that remembered when humans were prey. His radio crackled. "Brennan, this is Kowalski. You okay? You're late for check-in." Thomas keyed the radio, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm here. Found the missing hiker's campsite. It's been destroyed. No sign of her, but I've got a trail to follow." "Destroyed how? Bear?" Thomas looked at the shredded tent, the symbol scratched in the dirt, the place where Rachel's footprints simply ceased to exist. "Yeah," he heard himself say. "Probably a bear. I'm going to keep tracking northwest. Looks like she fled in that direction. Want me to notify Fish and Wildlife? If there's an aggressive bear in the area?" "Not yet. Let me confirm first. I'll call in when I have more information." Thomas clicked off the radio before Kowalski could respond. He knew he should call for backup, should follow procedure, should do everything his training dictated. But 3 years ago, when he'd tried to report what he'd really seen on Knife Lake, the looks on his colleagues' faces had told him everything he needed to know about what happened to rangers who claimed to encounter things that didn't fit in incident reports. And somewhere, deeper than rational thought, he understood that whatever was happening here, backup wouldn't help, might make things worse. He adjusted his pack and began following the elongated tracks northwest, into the deeper wilderness, where the elevation began to rise toward the rocky ridges that separated lake systems, where fewer hikers ventured, and the old forest pressed close with trees that had been growing before Minnesota was a state. The tracks led him through terrain that became increasingly difficult, rocky outcrops that forced him to scramble on hands and knees, dense thickets of alder that tore at his uniform, a creek bed lined with slippery stones that nearly twisted his ankle twice. Whatever had made the tracks moved through this landscape with ease, the prints showing no hesitation or difficulty. Thomas, by contrast, was sweating despite the cold, his lungs burning from exertion, his hands scraped raw from grabbing at branches and stone. After 2 hours, he emerged onto a ridgeline and stopped to catch his breath. Behind him, the forest spread out in shades of green and gold, a patchwork of lakes gleaming like scattered mirrors under the gray sky. He was maybe 5 miles from Sawbill now, deep enough into the wilderness that cell service was non-existent, and even the satellite phone would struggle to find a signal. Ahead, the land dropped away into a valley thick with old-growth spruce, the trees massive and dark, their lower branches dead and hanging like broken arms. And from somewhere in that valley came a sound that made every muscle in Thomas's body lock tight. It started as a high keening, almost like wind through a narrow gap, but it warped and shifted, dropping into a lower register that resonated in his chest, then rising again to a shriek that sounded exactly like a woman screaming. But there was something wrong with it, something that his ears recognized even as his conscious mind tried to reject it. The sound was too perfect, too precisely calibrated to human terror, like a recording played back, or a mockingbird's imitation of a scream. The sound cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so complete that Thomas could hear his own pulse hammering in his temples. He descended into the valley, moving slowly now, every nerve screaming at him to turn back. The spruce here were ancient, their trunks 4 and 5 feet in diameter, their bark thick with age. Very little light penetrated the canopy, and the air smelled of decay and something else, that same sweet chemical odor he'd noticed at the stone circle. His breath plumed white in the cold, and he realized the temperature had dropped significantly, even though it was only mid-afternoon. The tracks led him to a stand of trees that had been damaged recently, bark torn away in long strips, some of the strips hanging like ribbons, others scattered on the ground. And on the exposed wood, scored deep into the pale flesh of the tree, were symbols, not random marks but deliberate carvings, more circles with radiating lines, stick-figure humans with their mouths opened wide, and one symbol repeated over and over that Thomas recognized from his grandmother's stories. The Wendigo's mark, she'd called it, the sign that it was claiming territory. Thomas's radio crackled again, making him jump. "Brennan? Tom? You there?" He fumbled for the radio, his hands clumsy with cold and adrenaline. "Here. Tom, we've got a problem. Just got a call from the outfitter in Tofty. They've been trying to reach another one of their renters, a guy named Marcus Holt, solo camper. He was supposed to check in 2 days ago. His planned route..." A pause. "His planned route had him in the same area you're searching." Thomas closed his eyes. Description: white male, 42 years old, 6 feet tall, about 190. Last seen October 9th when he picked up his rental gear. October 9th, 4 days ago. The same day Rachel Anderson had reported hearing someone screaming in the forest, screaming that sounded like it was trying to sound human. "Tom, maybe you should pull back. Wait for a full search team, if there's something out there." "I'll call you back," Thomas said, and turned off the radio. He stood in the damaged grove, surrounded by carved symbols and the smell of wrongness, and made a decision that he knew might be the last one he ever made. He would find Rachel Anderson, or he would find what had become of her, or he would find Marcus Holt, or he would find what Marcus Holt had become, because he understood now, with a clarity that bypassed doubt, that the screaming Rachel had heard hadn't come from a victim. It had come from something that had already stopped being human, something that remembered how humans sounded when they were afraid, and was using that memory to hunt. The Wendigo. Thomas began walking again, following the tracks deeper into the valley, and as he walked he found himself reciting words his grandmother had taught him, words he hadn't spoken in 30 years, words in Ojibwe that asked for protection from the things that walked in winter, the things that were always hungry, the things that had once been human but had given up their humanity for the sake of survival, only to discover that survival without humanity was a special kind of damnation. The valley narrowed, the spruce pressing closer, and Thomas saw that the tracks were leading him toward a rock formation, a natural outcropping of granite that thrust up from the forest floor like broken teeth. There were caves there. He could see the dark openings, and scattered around the base of the outcropping were bones. Hundreds of bones. Deer, rabbit, possibly bear, all picked clean, all gleaming white in the dim light. And standing among the bones, perfectly still, was a human figure. Thomas stopped 30 feet away, his hand moving automatically to the bear spray on his belt, though some part of him knew that bear spray would be as useful as a prayer against what he was looking at. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, at least 7 feet, but so thin that it looked like it might snap in a strong wind. It wore the remnants of hiking clothes, a fleece jacket so torn it hung in strips, cargo pants dark with dirt and something darker. Its skin was gray, stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent, too sharp. Its hands hung at its sides and the fingers were too long, the joints too numerous, ending in nails that looked more like claws. But it was the face that made Thomas's throat close with horror, because he recognized it. Recognized the shape of the jaw, the structure of the cheekbones, even through the corruption that had overtaken them. This had been Marcus Holt. This had been a man who rented a canoe and went camping, who presumably had a life and people who cared about him, who made the mistake of being alone in the wilderness when hunger became too much. The Wendigo's eyes opened, fully black, reflecting no light, and its mouth opened too, wider than any human mouth should open, and from that mouth came Rachel Anderson's voice, perfect in every detail, desperate and terrified. Please, please help me. I'm hurt. I can't move. Please, someone help. Thomas felt tears streaming down his face, not from fear, but from a grief so profound it felt like his chest was collapsing. This thing had been human, had been a person who laughed and loved and made plans for the future. And now it was this, a creature of pure hunger, using the last human voice it had heard to lure more prey, repeating Rachel's words like a recording, because the person who had spoken them was already gone, already consumed, already part of the hunger that would never be satisfied. "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered. The Wendigo's head tilted, considering him with those black eyes, and when it spoke again it used a different voice, an older woman's voice, thick with a Scandinavian accent that Thomas recognized because his own grandmother had sounded similar. "Tommy, baby, don't be scared. Grandma's here. Grandma will keep you safe from the bad things in the woods." It had learned his name somehow, had reached into his memories or his fears or both, and was using his dead grandmother's voice to try to draw him closer. Thomas felt his sanity beginning to fracture, felt the careful wall he'd built around his experience on Knife Lake developing enormous cracks. The Wendigo took a step toward him, its movements somehow wrong, as if its joints bent in directions they shouldn't, and Thomas stumbled backward, his boot catching on a root, sending him sprawling. He hit the ground hard, his pack slamming into his spine, and looked up to see the creature looming over him, close enough now that he could smell the decay rolling off it in waves, could see the frost forming on its skin, despite the fact that it was 50 degrees and nowhere near freezing. Its mouth opened again, and this time it used Thomas's own voice, his exact inflection, speaking words he'd said 3 years ago on Knife Lake. "There's something wrong out here, something that shouldn't exist, but I saw it, and I can't forget it, and I think it knows I saw it." The Wendigo had been there. 3 years ago, it had heard him speaking into his radio, had listened to him trying to explain the unexplainable, and it had remembered. How many times had it circled back to this forest? How many winters had it survived by hunting the people who came to these woods for solitude and beauty, using their voices against the next victim, growing more skilled with each kill? Thomas's hand found the bear spray, pulled it free from his belt. But before he could raise it, the Wendigo moved with impossible speed, one long-fingered hand wrapping around his wrist, the grip so cold it felt like his bones were freezing solid. The bear spray fell from his numb fingers. The creature leaned closer, close enough that Thomas could see the rime of frost forming on its eyelashes, could smell the sweetness of rotting meat mixed with something sharper, formaldehyde maybe, or some chemical his brain couldn't identify. Its mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, and Thomas saw the rows of teeth inside, saw the gray tongue lolling, saw the back of the throat that seemed to extend into darkness far deeper than any throat should reach. And then, from somewhere behind him, a new voice. A real voice. Human and afraid but still fighting. "Get away from him!" The Wendigo's head snapped up, and Thomas twisted in its grip to see Rachel Anderson standing at the edge of the clearing, alive, holding a burning branch like a torch. Her face bruised and scratched, her clothes torn, but her eyes blazing with a fury that transcended terror. The Wendigo released Thomas's wrist and straightened to its full height, at least 8 feet now, its body seeming to stretch like taffy. And it turned toward Rachel with a keening cry that started in the register of human pain and descended into something so low, Thomas felt it in his teeth. Rachel held her ground. The burning branch extended before her and began to chant in what Thomas recognized as Ojibwe, words his grandmother might have known, words that came from somewhere older than states or countries or any human system of organization. Munido gichi munido bi indigawishin ganawendanandede. Spirit, great spirit, enter here, protect my heart. The Wendigo recoiled as if struck, and Thomas saw something he would never be able to explain in any report, could barely process even as he witnessed it. The creature's body wavered, became translucent, and through the translucency he could see another figure, smaller, more human-shaped, trapped inside like an insect in amber. Marcus Holt. What remained of Marcus Holt? Still conscious, still aware, screaming silently as the hunger consumed him from within. Rachel continued chanting, her voice growing stronger, and the burning branch seemed to burn brighter, the flames taking on a blue-white quality that had nothing to do with the wood's composition. The Wendigo writhed, its form becoming less solid, more like smoke, and Thomas heard voices coming from it now. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all the people it had consumed over the years or decades or centuries, all crying out at once. Thomas forced himself to his feet, his left hand still numb from the creature's grip, and stumbled toward Rachel. She grabbed his arm without stopping the chant, her eyes never leaving the wavering form of the Wendigo, and together they backed away, step by step, while the creature seemed to fold in on itself, becoming smaller, more compact, until it was nothing but a man-sized shadow on the ground, frost spreading from it in radiating patterns. They ran. Thomas had no memory of the route they took through the valley and back up the ridge. His body moved on autopilot, crashing through underbrush, scrambling over rocks, Rachel beside him, both of them gasping for air, neither speaking. The forest felt different now, less oppressive, as if some weight had been lifted. But Thomas knew better than to trust the feeling. They didn't stop until they reached the unnamed lake where Rachel's canoe waited, and even then, they only paused long enough to right the canoe and shove it into the water. They paddled in desperate synchronization, their strokes choppy and inefficient, but driving the canoe forward across the lake's gray surface. Thomas's injured hand screamed with pain every time he gripped the paddle, but he didn't care, didn't slow down, couldn't afford to look back at the forest they were leaving behind. It wasn't until they reached Sawbill Lake proper, where other canoeists were visible in the distance and the parking area was a concrete reality instead of a distant hope, that Rachel finally spoke. "It got Marcus 4 days ago." Her voice was hoarse, damaged from screaming or chanting or both. "I watched it happen. We were camped near each other, and I heard him crying in the night, saying he was so hungry, he'd never been so hungry, even though I'd seen him eat dinner. Then he started changing, growing. His skin went gray and his bones started showing through, and he just kept saying he was hungry. He was so hungry. Couldn't I understand how hungry he was?" Thomas paddled mechanically, letting her talk, knowing she needed to get it out. "I ran, left everything. Spent 2 days hiding, trying to make it back to the trailhead. But it followed me. It kept using Marcus's voice, then it started using other voices. My mother's voice, my ex-boyfriend's voice. It learned them somehow, pulled them out of my head, and used them to try to get me to come out of hiding. They reached the shore and dragged the canoe up onto the gravel. Other hikers were staring at them. 2 people who looked like they'd been through a war, covered in scratches and dirt, their eyes wild. "The symbols I drew," Rachel continued, still not looking at Thomas, still staring at the forest across the water. "I found them carved in a tree. Recognized some of the shapes from a comparative mythology class I took in college. Protection symbols, warnings. I thought if I made them big enough, clear enough, maybe someone would understand. Maybe someone would know what to do. Thomas thought about the words she'd chanted, the way the Wendigo had recoiled. Where did you learn those words? The Ojibwe? I didn't. Rachel finally turned to look at him, and Thomas saw the truth in her eyes before she spoke it. I've never spoken Ojibwe in my life. I don't know where those words came from. They just appeared in my mind when I saw it had you, like someone was giving them to me, teaching me. Thomas's grandmother had always said the spirits of the forest could protect as well as harm, could teach as well as destroy if you were willing to listen, if you were desperate enough, if the need was great enough. They walked to the parking area in silence. Thomas's truck was where he'd left it. Rachel's CRV sat nearby, waiting patiently. Everything looked so normal, so mundane, that for a moment Thomas could almost convince himself that the last 6 hours had been some kind of shared delusion. But his wrist was turning black with frostbite, the skin dead from where the Wendigo had gripped him. And Rachel's voice was damaged in a way that suggested she'd been screaming for longer than 2 days. And when Thomas checked his camera, found the photographs he'd taken of the torn tent and the symbols in the carved trees, they all showed something else too, barely visible in the background. A tall, thin figure standing among the trees, watching. He deleted the photographs one by one. Thomas called in on his satellite phone, reported that he'd found Rachel Anderson alive, that she'd been lost after an animal destroyed her campsite, that she was shaken but uninjured, that he was bringing her out now. He mentioned nothing about Marcus Holt because Marcus Holt was gone in ways that rescue teams would never find, consumed by hunger that could never be satisfied, transformed into hunger itself. The official report, filed 3 days later, stated that Rachel Anderson had become disoriented after a bear encounter, had abandoned her camping gear in a panic, and had survived through skill and luck until Ranger Thomas Brennan located her near Alton Lake. The report for Marcus Holt remained open, missing person, presumed lost in the boundary waters, search ongoing though prospects dim. The scratches inside Rachel's canoe were attributed to raccoons. The destroyed tent was attributed to bears. The carved symbols were noted as possible territorial marking by unknown wildlife. Thomas never returned to the valley with the caves and the bones. A month later, he requested a transfer to a different section of Superior National Forest, someplace with more traffic, more people, less wilderness. His request was granted without question, and if anyone noticed that he now refused to work solo patrols, no one mentioned it. Rachel Anderson returned to Colorado and never went camping again. She sold her hiking gear, her tent, her backpack, everything. She changed her phone number and deleted her social media and tried to forget the 2 days she'd spent running from something that used her mother's voice to call her name in the darkness. But sometimes, usually in winter, usually when she was alone, she would hear that voice again, distant but distinct, asking why she'd run away, asking why she didn't come home, asking why she didn't understand how hungry it was, how hungry they all were, how the hunger never stopped, never lessened, only grew and grew until hunger was all that remained. Thomas's wrist healed mostly. The frostbite claimed 2 fingers on his left hand, but the doctor said he was lucky it hadn't been worse, lucky he hadn't lost the whole hand, lucky to be alive. Thomas didn't feel lucky. He felt like he'd been marked, claimed, allowed to escape only because some bargain had been made that he didn't fully understand. On cold nights, his missing fingers ached with phantom pain, and he could feel something out there in the wilderness, vast and hungry and patient, waiting for winter, waiting for isolation, waiting for the next person who would venture alone into the deep forest when hunger became too much to bear. Because the Wendigo was always hungry, always. It ate and grew bigger, but the hunger only got worse. And it remembered being human. That was the terrible part. It remembered, and it hated what it had become, but it couldn't stop, could never stop, would never stop. And somewhere in the boundary waters, in a valley thick with old-growth spruce, among caves filled with bones, the thing that had been Marcus Holt waited for the next voice to imitate, the next human sound to weaponize, the next person who would hear their loved one calling from the forest and make the mistake of answering. Thomas kept his grandmother's protection words written on a piece of paper in his wallet, and every night before sleep, he recited them quietly, asking the spirits of the forest to keep the hunger at bay, to hold back the cold, to protect him from the things that had once been human, but had surrendered their humanity for the sake of survival, only to discover that some survivals are worse than death. He never went back to the Boundary Waters, not in the 5 years before he retired, not in the years after, but sometimes, usually in October, he would receive a phone call from the ranger station, from whoever was working the Sawbill area, asking if he remembered his time there, asking if he'd ever heard anything strange in the forest, asking if he knew anything about the reports. Always in winter, always during the coldest months, of voices calling from the wilderness. Voices that sounded exactly like missing persons from years or decades past. Voices that sounded like they were trying very hard to sound human. Thomas would say he didn't know anything about it, would recommend they follow standard protocols, would wish them luck and end the call, and then he would sit in his living room with all the lights on, his 8 remaining fingers wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, and he would listen to the wind outside his window, and sometimes, just sometimes, he would hear his own voice calling his name from the darkness, asking why he'd run away, asking why he didn't come back to the forest, asking why he didn't understand how hungry it was, how hungry they all were, how the hunger never stopped, never lessened, only grew and grew until hunger was all that remained. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Robert Chambers had always prided himself on being the kind of ranger who noticed things others missed. 17 years with the Superior National Forest Service had honed his observational skills to something approaching the scientific. He could read a trail like most people read newspapers, cataloging disturbances in the undergrowth, dating scat by its desiccation, estimating a hiker's weight by the depth of their boot prints in soft earth. On October 23, 2009, that meticulous attention to detail was the only thing standing between him and dismissing what he'd found at Hannah Voss's campsite as merely odd rather than impossible. The morning had started routine enough. Robert had left the Moose Lake Ranger Station at 0600, his 17-foot Grumman canoe loaded with the standard patrol gear, Motorola two-way radio, first aid kit, rope, tarp, emergency rations, water purification tablets, and his trusty Garmin GPS unit showing the route he'd paddle northwest toward Basswood Lake. The October air carried that particular crystalline quality that presaged winter, cold enough that his breath formed brief clouds, but not so frigid that the lakes had begun their freeze. Not yet. Though the Weather Service had been warning about an unusual cold front moving down from Manitoba, unseasonable enough that they'd issued advisories for anyone in the backcountry, Hannah Voss had filed her wilderness permit 9 days ago, a solo trek along the Northern Loop, experienced enough that the station chief hadn't flagged it for concern. Robert had reviewed her file that morning, 26 years old, biochemistry PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota, experienced backpacker with 4 previous BWCA trips logged. Her emergency contact was her dissertation advisor. The permit indicated she'd planned to camp at Bass Lake, then portage through to Basswood, spending 7 to 10 days collecting water samples for her research on lake acidification. When she hadn't checked in by her designated exit date, the automated system had flagged her permit and Robert had volunteered for the patrol. Solo hikers missing their check-ins usually meant injury, not catastrophe. Twisted ankles, capsized canoes, nothing that couldn't be handled by a ranger with basic medical training and a satellite phone. He found her campsite at 11:30, marked on his GPS as waypoint 17, exactly where her permit had indicated. The site sat on a granite shelf overlooking the eastern shore of Bass Lake, surrounded by white pine and paper birch, the kind of isolated spot that experienced campers sought out. Her green Kelty tent stood intact, properly staked, rain fly secured. Her canoe had been pulled up onto shore and overturned according to protocol. The stone fire ring showed signs of recent use, though the ashes were cold. Nothing appeared wrong at first glance. That was what bothered him. Robert had been doing wilderness searches long enough to develop instincts about abandoned camps. There was usually a narrative you could read: the hasty departure, the scattered gear suggesting panic, the damaged equipment indicating accident or animal encounter. Hannah's sight told no such story. Everything sat arranged with almost obsessive precision. Her camp stove rested on its designated stone. Her water purification pump hung from a bear bag line exactly 12 feet up a birch tree. Her hiking boots stood side by side outside the tent entrance, laces still tied. He called her name 3 times, the sound flattening against the water, swallowed by the dense forest behind him. No response except the distant cry of a loon. That sound that always reminded him of someone laughing at a private joke. Protocol demanded he search the immediate area before investigating the tent. Robert spent 20 minutes walking concentric circles outward from the campsite, looking for tracks, disturbed vegetation, anything suggesting Hannah had left on foot. The ground offered nothing useful, mostly granite and hard-packed earth that wouldn't take clear prints. He found a trail leading northwest toward the portage route to Basswood Lake, but after 30 yards it dead-ended at a granite outcropping with no indication anyone had passed recently. When he returned to the tent, Robert paused before unzipping the entrance. He'd learned early in his career that opening someone else's tent without permission felt intrusive, especially, when that someone might be injured or dead inside. He called Hannah's name once more, counting to 10, then crouched and worked the zipper. The interior stopped him cold, not because of what he found, but because of how it had been arranged. Hannah's sleeping bag lay perfectly flat, as if she'd taken time to smooth every wrinkle before leaving. Her backpack sat upright in the corner, every pocket zipped closed. A journal rested open on top of the sleeping bag, a pen laid across it with geometric precision. Her headlamp hung from the tent's interior loop, switched off. A Nalgene bottle sat beside the journal, still 3/4 full. Robert had seen abandoned campsites where the occupant left in a hurry, gear strewn about, sleeping bag half stuffed into its sack, food scattered. He'd seen sites where animals had gotten into the supplies, shredded fabric, claw marks, the chaos of wild things searching for calories. This looked like a museum diorama, everything positioned with unnatural care. He reached for the journal, then hesitated. The page it was open to showed Hannah's handwriting, the script even, and controlled at the top of the page but deteriorating toward the bottom. The letters growing larger and more erratic, the lines slanting downward in defiance of the paper's ruling. The entry was dated October 20th, 3 days ago. "Can't stop thinking about eating," it began. "Not hungry, physically full from lunch. But the idea of eating won't leave my head. Like there's a voice in my skull describing food. Not my voice. Sounds like wind through the pines, but somehow forming words. Ojibwe, maybe? Some of the syllables sound like the language lessons I listened to before the trip. Keep hearing Wahitko or something close. Probably just my mind processing the isolation. The cold doesn't help. Thermometer read 42 degrees this afternoon, but I'm wearing every layer I brought." Robert felt something tighten in his chest, a sensation he couldn't immediately name. Professional concern, he told himself. Hannah was clearly experiencing some kind of distress when she wrote this, but there was something about the careful description of the voice that unsettled him in a way missing persons reports usually didn't. He turned back to the previous entries, flipping pages backward. Hannah's journal read like a scientist's field notes for the first 4 days. pH measurements, water clarity readings, observations about seasonal fish populations. The entries were methodical, analytical. Then, starting October 18th, something feels off about this section of the lake. Water temps are 5 degrees lower than they should be for this time of year. No visible explanation, no springs, no unusual currents. Took samples from 3 locations. All showed the same anomaly. The locals at the ranger station mentioned this area, called it hungry water, thought they were joking about the fishing. Now I'm not sure. October 19th. Woke at 3 a.m. to sounds outside the tent. Footsteps maybe. But the gait was wrong. Too long between steps, like whatever was walking had an extended stride. Called out. Nothing. Temperature dropped to 31 degrees last night. Found frost on the tent fly, but when I checked my supplies, the ice in my cooler had partially melted. Doesn't make sense. Robert read that entry twice. the ice melting while the external temperature dropped below freezing. That wasn't just odd, it violated basic thermodynamics. He turned to the final entry, the one the journal had been left open to. The handwriting had degraded further by the last paragraph. The hunger is constant now. Ate everything I brought for dinner plus tomorrow's lunch rations. Still feels empty inside. The voice is clearer. It's saying the same word over and over. Wihitko, Witiko, Windigo. I looked it up in my phone before the battery died. Algonquian legend. Spirit of insatiable hunger, cannibalism, winter starvation. Jesus Christ, I'm a scientist. I don't believe in this, but something is in the trees and it wants... The entry ended there, mid-sentence, the final word trailing off into an ink smear, as if Hannah's hand had been jerked away from the page. Robert sat back on his heels, the journal resting on his thighs. The rational part of his brain, the part that had carried him through nearly 2 decades of wilderness work, insisted there was a logical explanation. Hannah was a scientist suffering from exposure, hypothermia producing confusion and paranoia. She'd wandered into the forest disoriented, and he'd find her within a mile radius, maybe injured, maybe hypothermic, but alive and explicable. The other part of his brain, the part he usually suppressed, remembered stories his grandfather had told him. His grandfather had worked these same forests in the 50s and 60s, before the Wilderness Act, when the area had been simply Superior National Forest, not a protected canoe area. The old man had been Ojibwe on his mother's side, and had grown up hearing the stories from the elders. He'd shared a few with young Robert late at night when they'd camped in these same woods. Robert had been perhaps 12 years old, at that age when scary stories thrilled more than frightened. One story had stuck with him, though. The one about the Wendigo. His grandfather had called it Witikaw in the old language, had explained that it wasn't just a monster in the European sense, but something more complex. A spiritual affliction, a possession, a transformation. Those who became consumed by greed, by hunger, by desperation, they could become Witikaw. And once transformed, they were no longer human. They became something that existed only to feed, to consume, never satisfied, always ravenous. The Ojibwe had ceremonies to prevent it, rituals to cure those in the early stages. But once the transformation completed, once the spirit fully took hold, there was only one solution: fire. Robert shook his head, physically trying to dislodge the memory. He was a federal employee with a bachelor's degree in forestry and 17 years of practical experience. He dealt in facts, procedures, documented reality. Hannah was experiencing a medical crisis, probably hypothermia-induced psychosis, and he needed to locate her before the cold front arrived and temperatures dropped further. He used his Motorola to call the Moose Lake station, getting Charlie Whitford, the seasonal ranger who was manning communications. Robert to base, over. Go ahead, Robert. Located the Voss campsite. Subject not present. Camp appears undisturbed, but journal entries indicate possible psychological distress. Temperature-related confusion, maybe hypothermia onset. I'm going to conduct an expanded search pattern. Over. Static crackled for a moment. Copy that. Weather Service is saying that cold front is accelerating. Could see temps in the low 20s by tonight. You want backup? Robert considered it. Getting another ranger out here would take 6 hours minimum, possibly longer. Negative. Going to search until 1600, then reassess. If I don't find her by then, I'll set up camp here and resume at first light. Over. Roger. Stay safe out there. Robert clipped the radio back to his belt and stood, surveying the campsite again. Where would a confused hypothermic hiker go? Usually toward water or along clear paths. The brain simplified navigation when compromised. The Portage Trail to Basswood Lake lay northwest. That's where he'd start. He marked the campsite location in his GPS, took a compass bearing and headed into the forest. The temperature dropped as he moved away from the lake, the canopy thickening overhead until the afternoon sunlight came through in narrow shafts that somehow made the shadows seem denser rather than illuminated. Robert had walked these forests hundreds of times, knew their rhythms and patterns, but something about this particular stretch felt different. The usual background noise, wind through pine needles, distant bird calls, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, seemed muted, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. He found the first sign of Hannah 20 minutes into his search. A torn piece of fabric, maybe 2 inches square, caught on a hawthorn bush. The fabric was dark blue, consistent with the jacket description in her file. Robert bagged it, marked the GPS coordinates, and continued northwest. The trail deteriorated rapidly after that. The official portage route veered west, but the fabric scrap had been northeast of the path, suggesting Hannah had left the maintained trail. Robert followed the trajectory, watching for more signs. He found them: a few broken branches at roughly chest height, a scuff mark on a mossy log, another fabric scrap 30 yards further on. She'd been moving fast, he realized. The broken branches suggested someone pushing through vegetation rather than moving around it, and the fabric tears indicated a lack of caution about snagging. Running, maybe. Or fleeing. From what? The question arrived unbidden, and Robert pushed it away. Fleeing from her own psychological breakdown, he told himself. From the confusion and panic that hypothermia could induce. He'd read case studies of hypothermia victims in advanced stages removing their clothing because they felt overheated, wandering away from shelter, making decisions that made no rational sense. Hannah's journal indicated she'd been cold, obsessively so. That fit the profile, but the hunger, that didn't fit. Robert checked his watch. 14:30, 2.5 hours before his self-imposed search deadline. He pressed deeper into the forest, following Hannah's trail. The trees changed as he walked, the white pine and birch giving way to older growth, cedar and black spruce that had probably been here when the Ojibwe had these lands to themselves. The trunks grew so close together in places that Robert had to turn sideways to pass between them, and the overhead canopy blocked out so much light that his eyes took several minutes to adjust. His breath came out in visible puffs now. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since he'd left Hannah's campsite. He almost missed the next piece of evidence because it wasn't fabric or footprints. It was the smell. Robert stopped, nose working. Something dead, he thought immediately. But not fresh. Old death. Frozen death. The kind of smell you encountered when you found a deer carcass that had lain through winter and was only now, with the spring thaw, releasing its rot. Except it was October, and nothing had frozen and thawed yet. The smell grew stronger as he walked until he was breathing through his mouth to avoid gagging. Then he saw it. A deer lay in a small clearing ahead, maybe 40 feet away. Or what had been a deer. The carcass had been opened from throat to hindquarters, the chest cavity completely empty, ribs splayed outward like grasping fingers. What remained looked freeze-dried, the flesh gray and desiccated, the eyes sunken into the skull. But here was the impossible part. The parts that remained looked fresh. No decomposition, no bloating, no fly activity. It looked as if something had consumed the deer's interior completely, while leaving the outer structure intact and somehow preserved. Robert approached slowly, professional curiosity overriding his revulsion. He'd seen plenty of predator kills: wolves, bears, occasionally a mountain lion, though they were rare this far north. This didn't match any of those patterns. Predators were messy, inefficient, scattering pieces of their kills over wide areas. This looked surgical, methodical, and the preservation made no sense. It couldn't have been here long, days at most, but it showed no signs of normal decomposition. He was leaning in to examine the exposed rib cage when he heard it. A sound from deeper in the forest. Not animal, not wind, something between the two. A low vocalization that might have been words if words could be formed by something that had never had human vocal cords. The sound made his teeth ache, vibrating at a frequency that seemed designed to trigger primal fear. Robert straightened, hand dropping instinctively to the can of bear spray on his belt. "Hannah?" he called out, knowing even as he said it that whatever had made that sound wasn't Hannah. The forest swallowed his voice, giving nothing back. He stood motionless for a 30 count, listening. The sound didn't repeat, but he couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. The feeling was so strong he found himself turning in a slow circle, scanning the tree line looking for anything that didn't belong. Nothing. just trees and shadows and silence. His radio crackled, making him jump. "Robert, this is Base. You copy?" He unclipped the radio, thumb on the transmit button. "Copy, Base. What's your status?" Charlie's voice came through with heavy static. "Weather Service updated the advisory. Cold front is moving faster than predicted. They're saying possible snow tonight. Temps dropping to 15 degrees. Station chief wants you back before dark. Over." Robert looked at his watch. 15:05. He had maybe 2 hours of good daylight left. The hike back to Hannah's campsite, then the paddle to Moose Lake would take at least 3 hours, probably 4 in the cold. "Base, I've got signs of the subject moving northeast from her campsite. Found a deer carcass that..." He paused, trying to find words that wouldn't sound insane over the radio. "That shows unusual predation patterns. I think there might be an animal situation out here. Recommend we organize a full search party at first light tomorrow. Over." A longer pause. Then Charlie's voice, more formal. "Robert, station chief is direct. Return to base before dark. That's an order. We'll organize SAR in the morning with proper support. Over." Robert wanted to argue. Every hour that passed decreased Hannah's survival odds if she was out here injured or hypothermic. But Charlie was right. Continuing alone and dropping temperatures with a storm coming would just create a second search and rescue situation. "Copy that, Base. RTB ETA 1900 hours. Over and out." He clipped the radio back to his belt and took one last look at the deer carcass, at the forest beyond it, at the darkening sky visible through breaks in the canopy. Then he turned back the way he'd come. The walk back to Hannah's campsite should have taken 25 minutes. It took 40 because Robert found himself stopping every few minutes, convinced he heard something following him. Not footsteps exactly, more like a disturbance in the forest's ambient sound, a moving pocket of silence that stayed consistently 40 or 50 feet behind him. Each time he stopped and turned, he saw nothing. Each time he started walking again, the sensation resumed. By the time he reached Hannah's camp, he'd convinced himself it was nerves, imagination, his grandfather's stories bubbling up from memory. But he packed his gear with unusual speed, loaded his canoe in under 5 minutes, and pushed off from shore paddling harder than necessary. The paddle back to Moose Lake was uneventful. He reached the ranger station at 19:15, 15 minutes past his estimated arrival, but still well before full dark. Charlie met him at the dock. "Chief wants to see you." Briefing room. Station Chief Margaret Halverson was a compact woman in her 50s, who'd worked her way up through the Park Service ranks with the kind of determination that intimidated even veteran rangers. She stood studying a topographic map of the Basswood Lake area when Robert entered, her finger tracing the route he'd taken that afternoon. "Tell me about this deer carcass," she said without preamble. Robert described what he'd found, trying to keep his language clinical and precise. When he mentioned the lack of decomposition, Halverson's expression tightened. "You think someone butchered it? Left it as some kind of cache?" "No, ma'am. The cavity was too clean. And there's the preservation issue. Nothing about it matched normal predation or human butchering." "So what are you suggesting?" Robert hesitated. This was where he had to be careful. "I'm not sure, but Hannah Voss's journal indicated she was experiencing extreme cold and unusual psychological symptoms before she disappeared. Now I've found a deer that looks like something drained it of everything internal while leaving the structure intact. I think we need to consider that there might be an environmental factor we're not aware of. Toxin in the water, maybe. Something affecting behavior and perception." It was a reach, but it was rational. It gave Halverson something concrete to work with. She studied him for a long moment. "You look spooked, Chambers." "Long day, ma'am. Cold getting to me." "Uh-huh." She turned back to the map. "Weather's going to be hell tonight and tomorrow morning. We'll send out a full SR team tomorrow afternoon after the front passes. I want you to lead it. You know the area, you've seen the campsite. Until then, go home, get warm, get some sleep." "What about Hannah?" "She's been out there 9 days. If she survived this long, 12 more hours won't matter. If she hasn't..." Halverson didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Robert drove home to his cabin on Moose Lake's western shore, the heater in his Ford F-150 blasting at maximum. The temperature gauge on his dashboard read 19 degrees. By the time he pulled into his driveway, snow had started falling. Small hard flakes that the weather service called graupel, somewhere between snow and hail. They hit his windshield with tiny ticking sounds that reminded him uncomfortably of teeth. Inside, he made coffee, stood in his kitchen drinking it while looking out at the lake. The snow was falling harder now, accumulating on the dock, on the overturned canoe in his yard, on the trees beyond. His cabin sat at the end of a dirt road, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. The isolation had always appealed to him. After days spent around other rangers and tourists, he valued the solitude. Tonight it felt different. The darkness beyond his windows seemed denser somehow, pressing against the glass. He forced himself to eat, heated up leftover chili, made toast, then sat down at his laptop to write up his report. The Park Service had strict protocols about documentation, and a missing person case required detailed notes. Robert typed methodically, describing everything he'd found. The campsite, the journal entries, the fabric scraps, the deer carcass. He tried to keep his language neutral and professional, but reading back over it, he could see how strange it all sounded. A scientist raving about hunger and voices, a deer gutted and preserved, temperature anomalies. He saved the document and closed his laptop, then sat staring at nothing, trying to ignore the fact that his mind kept returning to his grandfather's stories. The Wendigo wasn't just a monster, his grandfather had explained. It was a warning, a cautionary tale about what happened when survival instinct overrode humanity. The Ojibwe had lived in these forests for thousands of years, had endured winters that could last 6 months, had known starvation in ways that modern people couldn't comprehend. In those extremes, sometimes people made choices they couldn't come back from. And the stories about Witikow were a way of enforcing the taboo, of making sure everyone understood that some lines, once crossed, changed you forever. But his grandfather had also insisted the Witikow was real. Not metaphorical, not symbolic. Real. He'd claimed to have seen evidence of it twice in his years working the forest, though he'd never given details, just said that sometimes in the deep winter in the remote places, something moved through the trees that wasn't animal and wasn't human and was hungry in a way that natural things weren't hungry. Robert stood abruptly, went to his bookshelf. His grandfather had left him a few things when he'd passed away 8 years ago. Photographs mostly, some tools, and one book. A journal, really, handwritten in the old man's careful script. Robert had read through it once after the funeral, found it full of observations about the forest, notes on animal behavior, sketches of plants. Nothing mystical or supernatural. He'd shelved it and mostly forgotten about it. Now he pulled it down, flipping through pages. Near the end, in an entry dated December 1967, he found what he hadn't noticed before. Found evidence on the north shore of Knife Lake today. Kill site. Looked like deer, but wrong. All wrong. Cavity completely empty, like something sucked the insides out. No tracks. Temperature was below 0, but the carcass wasn't frozen. Billy Two Feathers said the word when I described it. Witikow. Said they'd done a cleansing ceremony in this area back in the 30s. Some trapper who'd come back from a bad winter changed. Said it sometimes takes decades for the spirit to fade completely. Told me to stay away from that area after dark. I listened. Robert read the entry 3 times. His grandfather had found the same thing. Same type of kill, same impossible preservation, same location. Knife Lake was 15 miles northeast of where he'd found today's deer carcass, the same general area. His hands had started shaking. He set the journal down, went to pour himself a whiskey, drank it in one swallow, then poured another. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving the snow against his windows in waves. The temperature was still dropping. Somewhere out there, Hannah Voss was either dead or dying or what? The thought he'd been suppressing all evening finally surfaced. What if Hannah's journal was accurate? What if she'd actually heard something, sensed something? She was a scientist, trained to observe and document. Her entries had been methodical up until the end, precise even in her description of her deteriorating mental state. What if she hadn't been experiencing psychosis? What if she'd been experiencing something else? Robert walked to his window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. The snow created a white curtain beyond the glass, limiting visibility to maybe 20 feet. Beyond that, darkness in the shape of trees indistinct in the storm. As he watched, something moved out there. A shadow among shadows, too tall to be a deer, too broad to be a person. It stood motionless at the edge of his vision, just barely visible in the ambient light from his cabin. Robert stared at it, pulse accelerating, telling himself it was a tree, a trick of the snow and darkness, his imagination fed by stress and his grandfather's stories. Then it moved. Not like an animal moves. No crouch, no careful steps. It simply relocated from one position to another 15 feet away, the movement almost instantaneous, like a film with frames cut out. Robert stepped back from the window, hand fumbling for the light switch. He killed the interior lights, plunging the cabin into darkness, and stood breathing heavily in the sudden blackness. Slowly, he moved back to the window, eyes adjusting. The shape was gone, or had never been there. He stood at the window for 10 minutes watching, seeing nothing but snow and trees and darkness. Eventually, he convinced himself it had been nothing, shadow and suggestion, his mind creating threat where none existed. But he left the lights off, and he brought his grandfather's journal to bed with him, and he didn't sleep well. The dream came around 3 a.m. In it, he was walking through the forest, following a trail he knew led somewhere important, though he couldn't remember where. The trees grew denser as he walked, their branches interlocking overhead until he was moving through a tunnel of wood and darkness. He could hear something ahead of him. Footsteps, breathing, a voice. Hannah's voice, he thought, calling for help. He tried to move faster, but his legs felt heavy as if he were wading through water. The voice got louder, more desperate. "Robert," it called. "Robert, please. I'm so hungry. I'm so cold. Robert, help me. I need..." The voice changed mid-sentence, dropping an octave, losing its human quality. "I need to feed, Robert. I need to consume. Come closer. Come help me. I'm still Hannah. I'm still me. Just come closer and see." He woke with his heart hammering, sheets soaked with sweat despite the cold. The clock read 03:17. Outside his window, the storm had intensified, snow and wind creating a white chaos that completely obscured the landscape. The temperature readout on his digital weather station showed 8 degrees. Robert got up, splashed water on his face, stood in his dark bathroom trying to calm his breathing. It was just a dream, stress and suggestion. In 6 hours, he'd lead a search team back to Hannah's campsite, and they'd find her, or find evidence of where she'd gone, and there would be a rational explanation for everything. Scientists didn't experience supernatural phenomena. Rangers didn't believe in monster stories. Everything had an explanation. He was repeating this to himself like a mantra when he heard the sound from outside. Not wind, not the creak of trees, not any sound the storm could make. A voice, distant but clear, speaking words he almost understood. Ojibwe words, he thought, or something close to Ojibwe. His grandfather had spoken the language, had tried to teach Robert a few phrases. He'd retained almost nothing, but he recognized the cadence. One word came through clearly, repeated 3 times. "Whitikow, Whitikow, Whitikow." Robert stood frozen in his bathroom, listening. The voice faded, swallowed by the storm, leaving him standing in darkness, wondering if he'd actually heard it, or if the dream had followed him into waking. He didn't sleep again that night. When dawn finally came, gray and cold and reluctant, he dressed in layers, made coffee he didn't drink, and drove to the ranger station through 6 inches of fresh snow. The briefing took 20 minutes. Station Chief Halverson laid out the search plan on the topographic map. 2 teams of 3 rangers each, equipped for winter conditions, with Halverson coordinating from the station. Robert would lead Team 1 back to Hannah's campsite, then expand the search northeast along the trajectory he'd traced yesterday. Team 2 would search the portage routes and alternate campsites. They had 12 hours of daylight, give or take. After that, with temperatures forecast to drop below 0 overnight, they'd have to suspend the search until conditions improved. One more thing, Halverson said, looking at Robert. I contacted a professor at the University of Minnesota last night, Hannah Voss's dissertation advisor. He said she'd been acting strange before the trip, obsessing about local legends, asking questions about historical accounts of cannibalism in the region. Said she'd stumbled on some old journals from a trapper in the 30s and was convinced they documented something unusual. He thought she was just getting too immersed in the research area, losing perspective. But given what you found yesterday, I wanted you aware. Robert felt something cold settle in his stomach. Did he say what the journals described? Deaths during a harsh winter, claims of possession, people driven mad by starvation, the usual frontier horror stories. Nothing verified, just local folklore. Halverson paused. Why? No reason. Just trying to understand her headspace. But it wasn't no reason, and they both knew it. Hannah hadn't been experiencing random psychosis. She'd been researching something specific, had come out here looking for evidence of something. And then her journal entries had started describing exactly what she'd been studying. The search team assembled at the dock. Robert, plus Rangers Tom Kavanagh and Lisa Chen, both experienced winter rescue specialists. They loaded 2 canoes with gear, including bivouac equipment in case they had to overnight in the backcountry. The paddle to Hannah's campsite took 90 minutes, fighting wind and the early stages of ice formation along the shoreline. The campsite looked different in daylight, under snow. The tent sagged slightly under accumulated weight. The fire ring had disappeared under white. Everything had a muffled, abandoned quality that made Robert's skin crawl. They searched the tent again, this time cataloging everything for evidence. Tom bagged Hannah's journal, along with her phone, water bottles, and sleeping bag. Lisa photographed the scene from multiple angles. Robert stood outside, ostensibly keeping watch, but really trying to suppress the growing sense that they were wasting time, that whatever Hannah had become or encountered wasn't something that could be found with standard search protocols. Robert. Lisa emerged from the tent, holding an item in her gloved hand. A small leather pouch, the kind used for tobacco or medicine. This was underneath the sleeping bag. Looks old. Robert took it carefully. The leather was cracked and stained, the sinew stitching frayed. He loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into his palm. Dried herbs, what looked like tobacco, a small bone carved with symbols, and a folded piece of paper. He unfolded the paper. Handwriting in faded ink, dated March 1934. For protection against Whitticow, sage, cedar, tobacco. Bone marked with 4 directions, carry always, burn cedar at night. Never speak its name after dark. If signs appear, cold that burns, hunger that cannot be satisfied, voices in the wind, leave immediately. Do not stay. Do not investigate. The spirit feeds on curiosity as much as flesh. The note was unsigned, but Robert recognized the handwriting, his grandfather's, which meant this pouch had been here for 75 years, left as a warning, as protection, as evidence that someone had known these woods held something dangerous. What's it say? Lisa asked. Robert folded the paper, put it back in the pouch, and lied. Old trapper's good luck charm. Superstition stuff. We should keep searching. They spread out, following the same trajectory Robert had traced yesterday. Tom took point, Lisa covered the southern flank, and Robert moved through the center, each of them separated by 50 feet, maintaining visual contact. The snow had obscured yesterday's tracks, but Tom found fresh signs within 20 minutes. Broken branches, a scrap of fabric, disturbances in the snow that might have been footprints if footprints could be 8 feet apart. She's running, Tom called out. Moving fast, northeast vector. Christ, she must be freezing. Unless she wasn't cold anymore, Robert thought. Unless whatever Hannah had been writing about in her journal had progressed beyond the early stages. Unless she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They followed the trail for an hour, moving deeper into old-growth forest where the canopy was so thick that snow had barely penetrated. The temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees for every 100 yards they traveled until Robert's breath created dense fog clouds and ice formed in his beard. His Garmin GPS showed they'd traveled almost 2 miles from Hannah's campsite, moving steadily northeast. Then the trail ended, not faded, not obscured. Ended. One moment Tom was pointing out a clear disturbance in the undergrowth. The next he was standing in a small clearing, turning in circles, confusion evident even through his winter gear. "Lost the trail," he called back. "Just stops, like she vanished." Robert and Lisa converged on his position. Tom was right. The signs of passage simply ceased in the middle of the clearing, no indication of which direction Hannah had gone from here. The clearing itself was strange, circular and almost perfectly flat, maybe 40 feet in diameter. The trees surrounding it were massive cedars, their trunks scarred with old markings. Not modern graffiti, but something older, carved deep into the wood. Symbols. Ojibwe pictographs, Robert thought, though he couldn't read them. In the center of the clearing, mostly buried in snow, something dark protruded from the ground. Robert approached it slowly, that cold feeling in his stomach intensifying. He knelt, brushing away snow with his gloved hand. It was the deer, or what remained of it. But this one was different from yesterday's kill. This carcass had been here longer, years probably, yet showed the same impossible preservation. The flesh looked freeze-dried, gray and leathery, but the structure was intact, and there were others, he realized, kneeling to clear more snow. 4 deer carcasses arranged in a circle, all showing the same pattern, opened from throat to hindquarters, cavity completely empty, preserved in defiance of natural decomposition. "What the hell is this?" Lisa whispered. Tom was examining the tree symbols, his headlamp illuminating the carved wood. "These are warnings," he said. "I did a rotation at Pipestone National Monument couple years ago, learned some Ojibwe cultural stuff. These symbols, they mark taboo sites, places you're supposed to avoid." "Why would Hannah come here?" Lisa asked. Because she was looking for it, Robert thought. She'd researched the legends, found his grandfather's journals or others like them, and came here specifically to investigate. She'd been documenting evidence of something the Ojibwe had known about for centuries, something they'd tried to contain with ceremonies and warnings and protective charms. He stood, turning slowly. The clearing felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. Not dangerous exactly, but heavy, as if the air itself had weight. The trees seemed to lean inward, creating the impression of standing at the bottom of a well. No birds called. No wind moved the branches. Everything was silent except the sound of 3 humans breathing. "We should leave," Robert said. "We haven't found her yet," Tom protested. "I know, but we should leave." Lisa was staring at something beyond the clearing, her expression troubled. "Robert, there's someone out there." He turned, following her gaze. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the shadows between trees, a figure stood motionless. Human height, but wrong proportions. Too tall, too thin, limbs too long. It stood in a way that humans didn't stand. Weight distributed impossibly, as if gravity affected it differently. "Hannah?" Tom called out. "Hannah Voss, if that's you, we're here to help." The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, watching them with intensity Robert could feel despite the distance. Then slowly, it began to move. Not walking, not running. That same impossible relocation Robert had seen from his window. Instantaneous shifts from position to position, moving from tree to tree in a way that made his eyes hurt, trying to follow it. "What the fuck?" Lisa breathed. "Back to the canoes," Robert said, keeping his voice level despite the terror rising in his throat. "Now. Don't run, but move." They retreated in formation, backing away from the clearing while keeping the figure in sight. It didn't pursue, just watched them go, that 2 tall silhouette stark against the snow. But as they moved, Robert heard it. The same sound from his nightmare, but awake now, undeniable. A voice speaking Ojibwe words, and underneath that, a sound like wind through bones, like ice cracking, like hunger given form. "Widikow," the voice said, clear as a bell despite the distance. "Widikow Bingwi, Widikow Niba." Tom was moving faster now, nearly running. Lisa kept pace, her hand on the bear spray at her belt, despite the fact that bear spray would be useless against whatever that was. Robert brought up the rear, walking backward, watching the figure as it stood motionless once more, surrounded by the tree symbols meant to contain it. They made it back to Hannah's campsite in half the time it had taken to reach the clearing, adrenaline overriding caution. Robert's mind was racing, trying to make sense of what they'd seen, failing. There was no rational explanation. That figure hadn't been Hannah, hadn't been human, had been something else, something that his grandfather's stories had warned about, something that the Ojibwe had known was real and had tried to keep contained. "We need to call this in," Tom said, pulling out his radio. "Get some kind of, some kind of backup." "And tell them what?" Robert asked. "That we saw something we can't explain? That we found a taboo site marked with symbols warning people away? That Hannah Voss might have been researching Wendigo legends and might have found something real?" The word was out before he could stop it. Wendigo. Witikow. The spirit of insatiable hunger. He'd said it aloud, given it form, and something in the forest seemed to respond. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees in seconds, frost forming on their gear, their breath coming out in dense clouds. "You think that's what that was?" Lisa's voice was shaking. "You think that's what happened to Hannah?" Robert didn't answer. He couldn't, because the answer was yes, he did think that, but saying it meant accepting that everything he'd built his career on, the rational approach, the scientific method, the documented reality, was insufficient to explain the world he actually lived in. His radio crackled. Halverson's voice heavy with static. "Team 1, what's your status?" "Over." Robert raised the radio, thumb on the transmit button. What could he say? That they'd found evidence of something the Park Service didn't have protocols for? That Hannah Voss had either become something inhuman or had been taken by something inhuman? That the forests he'd patrolled for 17 years contained things that shouldn't exist? "Team 1 to base. We found evidence of Hannah's route but lost the trail. Found unusual markings suggesting this area has historical significance to local tribes. Recommend we consult with Ojibwe elders about cultural protocols before proceeding." "Over." A long pause. Then Halverson, skeptical. "Cultural protocols? Robert, elaborate." "Over." "Taboo site, ma'am. The kind of place that has warnings. I think Hannah was researching local legends and came here deliberately. I think we're dealing with something outside standard SAR parameters. Request permission to return to base and regroup." "Over." Another pause. Longer. He could imagine Halverson's expression, the professional concern warring with practical skepticism. Finally, "Copy that, Team 1, RTB. We'll debrief when you arrive. Over and out." They loaded the canoes quickly, barely speaking. The paddle back to Moose Lake was tense, each of them scanning the shoreline, watching the tree line, looking for that too-tall figure. Robert's mind kept returning to his grandfather's journal entry, to the cleansing ceremony mentioned, to the warning that it could take decades for the spirit to fade. What if it hadn't faded? What if it had just been waiting? Back at the station, they sat in the briefing room while Halverson listened to their account. Robert could see the skepticism in her expression, the internal debate about whether to take them seriously or whether to recommend they all take psychological leave. When they finished, she sat silent for a long moment, fingers drumming on the table. "Let me be clear," she finally said. "You're telling me you saw something. Not Hannah, not an animal, not anything you could identify, standing in a clearing marked with Ojibwe warning symbols. And you believe this relates to the subject's disappearance. How?" "Hannah was researching historical accounts of cannibalism and possession," Robert said. "She came out here specifically to investigate a legend. Her journal entries document her experiencing symptoms consistent with that legend. We found evidence of her presence at a site that's clearly been used for ceremonial purposes, possibly for containment. I'm saying we should at least consult with someone who understands the cultural context before we send more people into that area." Halverson studied him. "You're a scientist, Robert. You have a degree in forestry. You're asking me to believe in folklore. I'm asking you to consider that there might be environmental factors we don't understand. Something in that area is affecting behavior and perception. Call it toxin, call it psychological phenomenon, call it whatever makes you comfortable. But something is there, and it's dangerous, and I don't think standard search protocols will work. It was the best he could do. Frame it in language that didn't require accepting the impossible. Halverson seemed to appreciate that. She nodded slowly. I'll make some calls. There's an Ojibwe cultural liaison who works with the Forest Service sometimes. I'll see if he's available to consult. She stood. Meanwhile, you three are off the search rotation. Take tomorrow to rest and write detailed reports. We'll reassess day after tomorrow. They were being sidelined, removed from the case because Halverson didn't trust their judgment. Robert understood it. If someone had come to him with a story about supernatural entities in the forest, he would have been skeptical too. But that was before. Before he'd seen that figure. Before he'd heard that voice. Before he'd held his grandfather's protective charm and understood that the warnings had been real all along. He drove home as the sun was setting, the sky turning that particular copper color that preceded deep cold. His cabin looked exactly as he'd left it that morning, but somehow different, as if the events of the day had changed his relationship with it. He no longer felt safe here, isolated at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by forest that might contain something he couldn't fight or understand. Inside, he made coffee, then stood at his window watching darkness claim the landscape. The snow had stopped, leaving everything crystalline and still. Beautiful, if you could forget what moved through it. His phone rang at 8 p.m. Halverson. The cultural liaison is coming tomorrow morning, she said without preamble. Name's William Kingbird. Works out of the Fond du Lac reservation. I briefed him on what you found. He wants to see the site. Did you tell him about what we saw? I told him you saw something you couldn't identify. He didn't seem surprised. A pause. Robert, he said something strange. Said this area has been a concern for a long time, that there were ceremonies done here in the past, but they haven't been maintained. Said sometimes the old protections fail, and the spirits return. He used a word I didn't recognize, Witikau. Robert closed his eyes. That's Ojibwe for Wendigo. Jesus Christ, he believes this? Apparently. And you? Do you believe it? It was the question Robert had been avoiding all day. Did he believe it? Could he believe it? His entire professional identity was built on rational analysis, on documented fact, on the knowable world. But he'd seen that figure. He'd heard that voice. He'd felt the terror that came from standing in a place where the normal rules didn't apply. I believe something is out there, he said finally. Something that Hannah encountered. Something that the Ojibwe have known about for a long time. Whether it's the spirit from the legends or something else, I don't know. But it's real, and it's dangerous. Halverson was quiet for a moment. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we figure out what to do. But sleep didn't come easily. Robert lay in bed reading his grandfather's journal, finding scattered references to the Witikau scattered throughout, always cautious, always oblique. His grandfather had known, had seen the evidence, had understood the danger, had tried to protect future generations with charms and warnings that had ultimately failed. Near dawn, Robert finally slept, and the dreams came again. Hannah's voice calling to him, leading him through the forest, promising answers if he'd just come closer. But when he got close enough to see her face, it wasn't Hannah anymore. It was something wearing Hannah's shape, something with eyes like windows into endless cold and hunger, something that smiled with teeth too sharp and too many, and whispered, I'm still me, Robert, just hungrier, just colder, just more. He woke, gasping, the dream lingering like smoke. Through his window, dawn was breaking, pale and cold, and standing at the edge of his property, just visible in the early light, was the figure from the clearing, watching his cabin, watching him. Robert didn't move, didn't breathe. The figure stood motionless for perhaps 30 seconds, then simply disappeared, not walking away, not moving, just ceasing to be there between one moment and the next. He showered, dressed, drove to the ranger station on autopilot, his mind still processing what he'd seen. William Kingbird was waiting in the parking lot, a man in his 60s with iron-gray hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He studied Robert as he approached, then nodded once as if confirming something. "You've seen it," Kingbird said. "Not a question." "Yes. And you're still here, which means it hasn't chosen you yet. That's good." Kingbird gestured to his truck. "Show me where you found the site." They drove in convoy, Kingbird following Robert's truck to the access point, then loaded canoes for the paddle to Hannah's campsite. Halverson had wanted to come, but Kingbird had been firm. Only essential personnel, only those who'd already encountered the site. Fewer people meant less risk. The paddle was silent. Robert kept scanning the shoreline, looking for that figure, but saw nothing except forest and snow. They reached Hannah's campsite, then hiked the 2 miles to the clearing. Robert leading the way, Kingbird following, moving with the assured gait of someone who'd walked these forests long before Robert had been born. The clearing looked different in daylight. The tree symbols were clearer, more intricate than Robert had realized. The deer carcasses stood out starkly against the snow, their preserved forms creating an almost decorative pattern. Kingbird stood at the clearing's edge, surveying it carefully, then spoke in Ojibwe, a long string of words Robert didn't understand, rhythmic and formal. A prayer, maybe, or a greeting, or a warning. When he finished, he turned to Robert. "This was a containment site. My grandfather helped create it back in the 30s. There was a trapper who came back from a bad winter changed, consumed by hunger even though he'd been rescued, obsessed with feeding even though there was food. He attacked another man, tried to do what the Wichtikau does. The elders performed a ceremony, tried to cure him, but it was too late. The spirit had taken hold completely, so they brought him here, to this place, and they bound the spirit with symbols and prayers and ceremony. Thought it would contain it until it faded. But it didn't fade," Robert said. "Spirits like this, they don't die easily. They need to be fed or they need to be starved, and containment just suspends them. Over time, the ceremonies weaken. The symbols lose power. Someone needs to maintain them, renew them, but the knowledge has been lost. Most of the young people don't believe anymore. They think the old stories are just superstition." Kingbird looked at him. "The woman you're searching for, she's gone. Either the spirit took her or she became the spirit. Either way, she's not Hannah anymore." "How do you know?" "Because Wichtikau doesn't just kill, it transforms. It takes someone and makes them into itself. Hungry, cold, desperate. And once the transformation completes, there's no going back. The person is gone. Only the spirit remains." Kingbird walked to the center of the clearing, studying the deer carcasses. "These are offerings in a way. The spirit feeds on them when it can't find humans. But it prefers humans. Needs them. Eventually. What do we do?" Kingbird was quiet for a long time. Then, "The traditional solution is fire. Burn the body, melt the heart of ice. But first you have to find it, and the Wichtikau is clever. It moves between worlds, hides in cold and shadow. And it's strongest now. It's been fed, renewed, has taken a new host. We'd need help, need proper ceremony, need time to prepare." "We don't have time. It's been coming to my cabin." That got Kingbird's attention. "It's marked you?" "I think so. I've seen it twice now." "Then it considers you part of this. You entered its territory, disturbed its feeding ground, carried protective items. It sees you as a threat or as prey, maybe both." Kingbird reached into his jacket, pulled out a bundle of dried herbs. "Sage and cedar, tobacco. Burn this in your cabin tonight in each corner. Keep fire going. The spirit can't cross flame. And whatever you do, don't go into the forest alone after dark. That's when it hunts." They returned to the ranger station as afternoon waned. Halverson listened to Kingbird's explanation with an expression that cycled through skepticism, concern, and finally grim acceptance. "So you're saying Hannah Voss is dead?" "I'm saying Hannah Voss is gone," Kingbird corrected. What's left isn't her anymore. And we can't do a traditional search and rescue because you'd be sending people to feed a spirit that's already consumed one person and is looking for more. Kingbird leaned forward. Chief Halverson, I understand this isn't in your protocols, but I'm telling you as someone whose family has dealt with this for generations, the best thing you can do is close this area, restrict access, give me time to gather people who know the proper ceremonies. I can't officially close public land based on folklore, then do it based on dangerous wildlife. Say there's an aggressive predator, say whatever you need to say, but keep people out. They argued for another 20 minutes, but Kingbird was immovable, and eventually Halverson relented. The area would be temporarily restricted, officially due to wolf activity. SAR operations for Hannah Voss would be suspended pending environmental assessment. It was bureaucratic language that meant they were giving up, that they were choosing containment over rescue. Robert drove home in early dusk, the sky already darkening, temperature dropping toward zero. He followed Kingbird's instructions, burning the sage and cedar in each corner of his cabin, keeping his fireplace stoked high. Then he sat in his living room with lights blazing, his grandfather's journal open on his lap, waiting. The figure appeared at midnight. Robert saw it through his window, standing in the same place as before, at the edge of his property, just beyond the reach of his porch light. But this time it moved closer, one of those impossible relocations bringing it to the edge of the light. Robert could see it more clearly now, impossibly tall, skeletal, proportions all wrong. And the face. God, the face. It might have been Hannah's face once, but stretched and wrong. Eyes too large and too dark, mouth too wide, teeth too sharp. It looked at him through the window with expression that was somehow both hungry and sad, as if some part of Hannah still existed inside that thing, trapped and aware and desperate. Robert, it said, voice carrying through the glass, through the walls, directly into his head. I'm so cold, Robert. So hungry. Please, help me. He wanted to respond, wanted to go to her, wanted to help. The urge was almost overwhelming, some primitive instinct to aid someone in distress. But he remembered Kingbird's warnings, remembered his grandfather's stories, remembered that what stood outside wasn't Hannah anymore. You're not her, he said aloud, his voice shaking. She's gone. You're Wittekow. The figure tilted its head, that too wide mouth curving into something that might have been a smile. I'm both, it said. I'm Hannah and I'm the hunger. I'm the cold and the need. I'm what happens when the wilderness takes back what it's owed. She came looking for me, Robert. She wanted to understand. Now she does. Now she is me. And you. It moved closer, face pressed against the glass now, breath fogging the window despite the fact that it shouldn't have breath. You're next. You're marked. You entered my place. You touched my things. You belong to the hunger now. Robert stood, backing away from the window, hand fumbling for his phone. Who could he call? Halverson? Kingbird? What could they do? But even as he thought it, the figure pulled back from the window, standing upright, and Robert saw it clearly for the first time. 7 feet tall at least, impossibly thin, ribs visible through translucent skin that looked like ice given form, fingers too long and tipped with black nails, antlers or bones or something protruding from its skull in a crown of calcified horror. The cold is coming, Robert, it said, its voice like wind through a grave. The real cold, the old cold. And when it comes, I'll come with it. You can't hide in your cabin forever. Eventually, you'll have to leave. Eventually, you'll be hungry, and the hunger will call you out into the dark where I'll be waiting. That's how it works. That's how it always works. The hunger wins. The cold wins. The wilderness wins. It just takes time. Then it was gone. Vanished between one moment and the next, leaving Robert standing in his living room, heart hammering, terror so acute it felt like nausea. He called Kingbird. It took 6 rings before the older man answered, voice rough with sleep. It was here, Robert said. At my cabin, it spoke to me. Silence for a moment. Then, what did it say? Robert relayed the conversation, his voice shaking. When he finished, Kingbird sighed. It's claimed you, marked you as next. The spirit feeds slowly. It doesn't just consume flesh, it consumes will, slowly eroding your resistance until you come to it voluntarily. That's how it works. It makes you want to surrender, makes the cold seem inviting, makes the hunger seem like freedom. How do I stop it? You don't. Not alone. We need to destroy it completely, which means ceremony and fire and time to prepare. But that thing that used to be Hannah, it's not going to wait. It's going to keep coming, keep calling, keep pushing until you break. Another pause. Can you leave? Go stay somewhere else? Somewhere far from here? And lead it somewhere with more people? More potential victims? The spirit is bound to the forest, to the cold, to this place. If you left, it probably couldn't follow far. But Robert couldn't do that. Couldn't just abandon this. Couldn't let that thing continue to exist, knowing what it was and what it had done. His grandfather had known about this, had tried to contain it, had left warnings and protections. Robert was the only one left who understood, who believed, who could finish what his grandfather had started. No, he said. I'm staying. Tell me how to fight it. Kingbird was quiet for so long that Robert thought the connection had dropped. Finally, the old way is fire and ceremony. We'd need to lure it to a prepared site, trap it with symbols and prayer, then burn the host body completely while calling the spirit by its true name and commanding it to leave this world. But it takes multiple people, takes preparation, takes things I don't have readily available. How long? 3 days minimum, maybe 4. Can you last that long? Could he? Robert looked around his cabin at the fire burning in the hearth, at the sage smoke still lingering in the corners, at the night pressing against his windows. 4 days of waiting, of that thing calling to him, of the hunger slowly eroding his will. I'll try, he said. The next 3 days were the longest of Robert's life. He didn't go to work, called in sick, which Halverson accepted without question. She understood what was happening, even if she couldn't officially acknowledge it. Instead, Robert stayed in his cabin, keeping the fire burning constantly, burning sage every few hours, eating though he had no appetite, drinking water, though his mouth stayed dry with fear. The Wendigo came every night. Sometimes it looked like Hannah standing at the edge of the light, pleading for help. Sometimes it looked like the monster it was, all bones and hunger and malevolence. Sometimes it didn't appear at all, but Robert could feel it circling his cabin, testing his defenses, looking for weakness. The psychological toll was worse than the fear. Robert found his thoughts turning strange, obsessive. He'd catch himself thinking about how cold it was, how nice it would be to just go outside for a moment, how the hunger in his stomach felt almost good, almost cleansing. He'd be halfway to the door before he realized what he was doing, before the last shreds of his rational mind screamed at him to stop. On the third night, he dreamed he was the Wendigo, felt what it felt, the constant burning hunger that nothing could satisfy, the cold that had replaced his blood, the desperation that had consumed every human thought. He understood then that Hannah hadn't just been killed or transformed. She'd been hollowed out, everything that made her herself scooped away, leaving only appetite and anguish. And some part of her was still in there, still aware, trapped forever in a body that existed only to feed. He woke screaming. On the morning of the 4th day, Kingbird arrived with 5 others, 3 older Ojibwe men and 2 women, all carrying bundles and supplies. They didn't speak much, just nodded to Robert and began preparing. They spent hours in the clearing where they'd found Hannah's trail, creating a ceremonial space, burning tobacco, laying out symbols in the snow, speaking prayers in Ojibwe. Robert watched from a distance, following their instructions. Stay back. Don't interfere. Keep the protective herbs burning. As the sun set, they built a fire in the center of the clearing, large and hot. One of the women, Kingbird introduced her as Mary Driftwood, a medicine woman, began singing in Ojibwe, a repetitive chant that raised the hair on Robert's neck. The others joined in, their voices creating a pattern of sound that seemed to resonate with the forest itself. Then they called it. Kingbird had explained the logic. The Wendigo couldn't resist a direct challenge, especially not when done with proper ceremony. It would come to defend its territory, to consume those who dared confront it, and when it came, they'd be ready. The singing grew louder, more insistent. Mary threw tobacco and sage into the fire, the smoke rising thick and white. And from the forest, Robert heard it, that sound like wind through bones, like hunger given voice. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Frost formed on the trees, on the ground, on their gear. Then it emerged from the darkness, moving with that impossible gait, and Robert saw it fully for the first time. 7 feet tall, skeletal, covered in what looked like frost-burned skin stretched over bone. Antlers protruded from its skull, massive and white like dead wood. Its eyes were Hannah's eyes, but empty, just holes leading into darkness. And it radiated cold. Not normal cold, but something deeper, older, the kind of cold that preceded death. Widikow, Mary called out in Ojibwe, then switched to English. Spirit of hunger, spirit of cold, we name you and bind you. You have no claim here. You have no power here. Return to the darkness from which you came. The Wendigo screamed, a sound Robert would hear in nightmares for the rest of his life. It tried to enter the clearing but couldn't. The symbols held it back, the ceremony creating a barrier it couldn't cross. It paced the perimeter, testing the boundaries, that skeletal face twisted with rage and hunger. Kingbird began speaking in Ojibwe, a formal recitation that had the weight of ritual. The others joined in, their voices creating a pattern of command. The Wendigo screamed again, slamming against the invisible barrier, and for a terrifying moment, Robert thought it might break through. But the barrier held. Now, Mary said, and 2 of the men threw something into the fire. Herbs, oils, something that made the flames leap 10 feet high, turning blue-white, intense enough that Robert had to shield his face. The Wendigo shrieked and tried to flee, but the ceremony had trapped it, bound it to this place. It moved in circles, becoming more frantic, and Robert realized it was shrinking, the impossible height diminishing, the monstrous form collapsing inward. The frost on its skin began to melt, running like tears, and underneath he could see Hannah's face, her real face twisted in agony. "I'm sorry," he heard her say, her real voice under the monster's howl. "I'm so sorry. I was so hungry. I just wanted to understand. I didn't know." The ceremony reached its crescendo, all 7 voices speaking as one, and the Wendigo collapsed, its form condensing down into something almost human-sized, a body lying in the snow at the clearing's edge. Mary gestured, and 2 of the men carefully approached, dragging the body toward the fire. It was Hannah, or what remained of her. Her eyes were open, aware, and in them Robert saw terror and relief, and a desperate plea for ending. "It's okay," he said, kneeling beside her as the men paused. "It's going to be okay now." "Cold," she whispered, her voice her own again, but faint. So faint. "So cold, Robert. Make it stop. Please, make the hunger stop." They lifted her body and placed it in the fire. The flames consumed it instantly, burning with that unnatural blue-white intensity, and for a moment Robert saw something rise from the fire. A shape, a shadow, a spirit screaming its defiance and rage before the ceremony pulled it down, forced it away, banished it from this world back to whatever darkness had spawned it. The fire burned for an hour, reducing everything to ash. When it finally died, only white powder remained. No bones, no evidence that Hannah Voss or the Wendigo had ever existed. Mary spoke more prayers, and the others worked to reinforce the symbols on the trees, to strengthen the containment. "It's done," Kingbird finally said, his voice exhausted. "The spirit is gone. Hannah is at peace." But was she? Robert thought about her final moments, trapped in that form, aware of what she'd become, desperate for death. What kind of peace was that? They left the clearing as dawn broke, Robert following the group back to civilization, his mind still processing what he'd witnessed. At the ranger station, Halverson was waiting. her expression carefully neutral. "William briefed me," she said. Officially, Hannah Voss succumbed to exposure and hypothermia in the backcountry. Her remains were irretrievable due to wildlife activity and environmental conditions. That's what goes in the report. Robert nodded. It was the only story that made sense, the only one anyone would believe. The truth, that Hannah had found exactly what she'd been looking for, had documented it carefully right up until it consumed her, had become the very thing she'd studied, would never appear in official records. "How are you?" Halverson asked, and for a moment her professional mask slipped, showing genuine concern. "I don't know," Robert said honestly. "I saw something that shouldn't exist. I watched it be destroyed. I don't know how to come back from that." "Maybe you don't," she said. "Maybe you just learn to live with it." Robert took a week off after that, spending his days sitting by his fire, trying to make sense of what he'd experienced. He read his grandfather's journal cover to cover, finding new meaning in every entry, understanding now why the old man had been so careful, so cautious. The forests held more than trees and animals and weather. They held old things, spirits and powers that existed in the spaces between rational explanation and human experience. When he finally returned to work, he was different, more careful, more respectful, less certain that science explained everything. He didn't talk about what had happened. Halverson had made that clear, and Robert understood the wisdom of silence. But sometimes, late at night, he'd stand at his window and look out at the forest, at the darkness beyond his porch light. And he'd remember what his grandfather had written. "The wilderness doesn't belong to us. We're just visitors, barely tolerated. And sometimes, when we forget that, when we push too far, when we seek things we shouldn't seek, the wilderness reminds us of our place." Hannah had sought answers to questions that should have stayed unasked. She'd found them. And in finding them, she'd paid a price that Robert would carry with him for the rest of his life. The cold returned that winter, harder than usual, and Robert found himself listening to the wind through the trees, wondering if he heard words in it, wondering if the hunger was truly gone or just waiting, patient as winter, hungry as the dark. He kept sage burning in his cabin every night, just in case. Some lessons he'd learned were worth remembering. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.